Let us enter the streets of late classical Athens, a city still animated by the sharp clarities of public debate and the stubborn clamor of its new political experiment, democracy. The air carries the dust of the marketplace, the echoes of soldiers marching to the gymnasium, the murmur of scribes and students gathering in porches and stoi. In this world, the old world and the new collide. The old world of mythic authority, the new world of civic inquiry, the old oration of persuasion, the new discipline of argument. In this setting, Socrates becomes not merely a man of questions, but a figure whose presence unsettles the city's confidence in wisdom handed down from authority or tradition. He does not write books, he conducts conversations, a kind of practical philosophy that aims to illuminate, to calibrate, and perhaps to unsettle. The scene is intimate, almost performative, the spoken word working in the moment, a living workshop where ideas are tested by a battering of questions and counter-questions. But the arc of Plato's project is not limited to one man in a single city street. It is a transformation in the way philosophy is done. If we listen closely to the sound of the dialogue, we hear the shift from oral, face-to-face exchange to something larger. An enterprise that can be transplanted into a formal institution, a sanctuary of sustained inquiry where questions are pursued across days and seasons rather than in a single public debate. That shift is not merely organizational. It is methodological, epistemological, and literary. It is the shift from the Socratic method as a device for exposing ignorance to a Platonic program that uses that exposure as a spur toward a more durable form of knowledge. The Athenians who once gathered to test themselves against a single, fearless interrogator now witness the emergence of the academy, a formal school dedicated to the long, patient discipline of philosophy, mathematics, and dialectic. In this space, the living dialogue, Socrates speaking, others listening, questions being posed and reposed, becomes a model for how to think, teach, and cultivate a shared practice of inquiry. In the background of all this, we must remember the long philosophical lineage that makes Plato's project intelligible. Think for a moment of Parmenides and Heraclitus, the Eleatic and the flux-minded. Parmenides insists that being is, and that movement, becoming, and non-being present challenges that cannot disturb the serene unity of what truly exists. The famous, stark line, though the exact wording travels through centuries in many voices, points to a stubborn adherence to what endures. In stark contrast, Heraclitus speaks from the bank of the flowing river, reminding us that everything that seems stable is already in motion. You cannot step into the same river twice. The two voices press Plato to ask, what is the enduring ground of reality if change is so radical, and how can knowledge be possible if the world is perpetually shifting? The dialogue form itself becomes a means of negotiating this tension, traversing from the certainty of being to the uncertainty of becoming, and asking whether there might be a form of knowledge that can withstand the tempests of all change. We also meet the Pythagoreans who pose another kind of question. What is form? What is order? What is harmony? They offer a language of structure, of number as the organizing principle of the cosmos, of the soul's affinity with proportionality and ratio. All things are number, they say, a maxim that sounds almost mathematical in its calm claim. Plato will, in turn, take up that sense of a rational order and push it beyond arithmetic into a larger metaphysical program, the world of form, of eternal truths that undergird sensible experience, of a republic of beings that only the philosopher, through rational assent, can glimpse and govern. Yet against the appeal to a grand, fixed order, Aristotle's later critique reminds us that philosophy cannot rest on form alone. The later surge of substance, of a focus on material substrata, and the insistence on empirical articulation push back against a sole devotion to abstract form. The conversation, then, is not merely a backward-looking memory of a single man's inquiries, but a living chain that stretches from the Eleatics through the Academy and into the history of philosophy itself. To tell this story well, we must begin not with a system, but with a life, the life of a thinker, the life of a city, and the life of a school that sought to cultivate a disciplined practice of inquiry. We begin with the biographical context, the figure of Socrates as a catalyst, the unique culture of late 5th century Athens, the social and intellectual ferment that makes the elenchus both possible and perilous, the moment when writing enters philosophical life in a more pronounced way through the dialogues of a student who will become a master in his own right. Then we turn to the method in practice, the elenchus, the tracing of definitions, and the aim that emerges from this practice. To elicit stable norms, to reveal the dependence of particular judgments on a shared standard, to avoid victory in rhetoric for its own sake, and to keep the aim squarely on knowledge that rests on a firm foundation. After that, we will listen to the dialogue as a literary philosophical form, to the vivid way the scenes themselves teach as they unfold, and to the earliest dialogues that establish the program, while tracking how later works enlarge the horizon to metaphysics and politics. Finally, we shall examine the Academy's legacy, how a formal institution can shape a living method, how mathematics and geometry become a language for philosophical argument, and how the Academy both inherits and transforms the currents of its time. Biographical context: the lives that shape a method. Socrates arrives in Athens not as a professor, not as a respected elder statesman, but as a man who asks questions that seem to probe the very ground people stand on. He is often described as a gadfly, a creature whose waking sting is truth-telling in a city that prefers the easy comfort of pieties and customary opinions. He does not write to posterity, and yet his living method persists in the way his friends and challengers speak in the dialogues. The cultural environment he inhabits, Athens at the end of the 5th century BCE, has a particular texture. The city is a theater of democratic debate. It is a place where rhetoric matters as a tool of persuasion and a method of persuasion. The sophists travel from city to city, offering instruction in the arts of persuasion, often with no shared standard of truth beyond the skillful performance of argument. In this swirling atmosphere, Socrates is both allied with and opposed to a certain current. He is a gadfly to the pretensions of quick, winning rhetoric, yet he also participates in the public life of inquiry that democracy requires. His method, which proceeds by question and cross-examination, makes visible not the triumph of rhetorical show, but the fragility of unexamined beliefs. The portrait of Socrates that emerges through the early dialogues is one of a man who measures every claim against something he calls knowledge or wisdom, even if his own certainty about the content of knowledge remains deliberately modest. He often claims a form of ignorance that is paradoxically more demanding than false certainty. To know one's ignorance is to be aware of the boundaries of understanding and to keep asking questions that test whether a belief can bear the weight of universal application. The famous line often attributed to him, though not in every exact form in every dialogue, becomes a guiding motto for what the Elenchus tries to do: to bring beliefs into the light of reason, to pull them away from mere acceptance by habit, and to submit them to the scrutiny of definition and demonstration. What is most important for our purposes is not only who Socrates was but how Plato reinterprets him. Plato does not simply record the man's questions, he refigures Socrates as a vehicle for enduring inquiry. If Socrates' life ends in a famous trial and an execution that becomes a kind of public pedagogy in reverse, Plato takes the energy of that moment and moves it into a school, into the rooms of dialogue that persist beyond a single debate. In doing so, he gives Socrates a new form of afterlife, a living method, a method that can be taught, a discipline that can be handed from one generation to the next with a chain of reasoning that can be examined, criticized, refined, and expanded. The Academy grows from this impulse, an institution designed not merely to preserve a certain set of beliefs, but to cultivate a method that can be used to test beliefs about justice, knowledge, beauty, and the nature of reality itself. The trial and execution of Socrates, the founding of the Academy, and the cultural matrix in which these events occur are not mere background. They are the emotional and intellectual seedbed for what follows. The trial, most readers know the charge, impiety and corrupting the youth, ironically provides a public demonstration of how dangerous Socratic questioning can seem in a city that equates virtue with social order and truth with accepted tradition. The defense, oscillating between bravado and philosophical resolve, reveals the ethics and courage of a man who would rather face a death sentence than abandon his inquiry. The execution itself becomes a powerful, symbolic coda. If the last hours of Socrates show a man who refuses to pretend that death defeats inquiry, they also reveal a city still wrestling with the duty to confront truth, even when it unsettles political and social arrangements. Plato learns from this scene a crucial truth: a method that asks for universal norms cannot be content with winning a rhetorical contest. It must endure the temptation to retreat into silence in the face of power. If the trial marks the public political consequences of Socratic questioning, the founding of the Academy marks the institutional consequence, a shift from a contingent oral culture of philosophical exchange to a formal, ongoing practice. The Academy is established around 387 BCE, near the grove of the hero figures, and certainly near the central streets where students and teachers would gather for instruction. It is a place where mathematics and dialectic become, at once, a pair of pedagogical instruments. The cultivation of geometry and proportion is not merely a mathematical hobby, it becomes a method for shaping mind and argument. The geometric method, clear, rigorous, demonstrative, becomes a model for philosophical inquiry. The Academy is not simply a school, it is a living ecosystem where the questions Socrates raised are kept in circulation, where new questions arise, and where a discipline of rational inquiry can be pursued over long stretches of time. In this way, the Academy helps to legitimate the idea that philosophy can be systematic, patient, and cumulative, rather than a set of lucky insights scattered in conversations. Two distinct anecdotes illuminate the Academy's character and its influence. The first concerns its founding moment. We know that Plato, having learned from Socrates, moves to establish a place where dialogue can continue beyond the city's immediate streets. He chooses a site that was once a public garden, linked to the name Academos, and in it he creates a space where students gather to practice a kind of dialectical discipline that resembles a gymnasium for the mind. The Academy's earliest atmosphere is one of serious play. Discussions range across ethics, politics, epistemology, and the nature of reality, but they are conducted with a shared standard of rigor that mirrors the demonstrative clarity of mathematics. The second anecdote speaks to the Academy's enduring mathematical culture. The tradition that gathers around Plato's school, whether through Theaetetus, Eudoxus, or their circle, emphasizes geometric demonstration, proportion, and the rigorous discipline that mathematics requires. The Academy becomes a place where mathematics is not merely an applied tool, but a philosophical grammar, a way to articulate the relations between forms, substances, and the objects of knowledge. It is easy to imagine a student practicing a geometric demonstration and hearing, in the same breath, the argument for the form of the good, a unity that explains why certain things are intelligible and others are not. If we pause here to reflect on this double movement, the life of Socrates in the streets of Athens and the life of the Academy inside a garden near the city, we begin to hear the deeper claim of Plato's project. Philosophy emerges as a disciplined art, a method that can be taught and learned, a practice that shapes both mind and community. The elenchus is not mere theatrical questioning. It becomes a way of training the mind to see the structure of a thing as it truly is, rather than as one wishes it to be. The Academy, then, is not a sanctuary of dogma, but a workshop for the ongoing refinement of methods, the careful tracing of definitions, and the patient ascent toward universals that illuminate particular cases. The method in practice, elenchus, definition tracing, and the aim of stable norms to understand Plato's context, it is essential to grasp the method, dialectic in the sense of a living practice rather than a mere sequence of propositions. The core elements are threefold: the elenchus, the cross-questioning that tests a definition by exposing its inconsistencies, a disciplined tracing of definitions from a rough sense of a term to a precise conception that can withstand critical scrutiny, and an overarching aim that goes beyond winning an argument to arriving at stable, knowable norms that can be shared across cases and communities. This is not rhetoric. It is a form of disciplined inquiry whose goal is not persuasion in a debate in the agora, but the acquisition of a form of knowledge that commands rational assent. The elenchus is the face of the method, most familiar to readers of the early dialogues. It unfolds as a sequence of questions and answers, a careful back and forth that reveals where a claim rests, what it presupposes, and what it presupposes in turn. The method is not designed to humiliate or trap the interlocutor, though it can appear relentless. It aims to extract from a speaker a definition that can be defended, step by step, against all comers. When a definition appears plausible in a first moment, the elenchus then subjects it to radical testing. The test tries to reveal hidden dependencies, inconsistencies, or a failure to capture the essential nature of the thing being defined. If the definition proves inadequate, the interlocutor is asked to reformulate or to concede the need for a broader or more precise term that can accommodate more cases without collapsing into contradiction. Definition tracing plays a crucial role here. A philosopher does not simply proclaim a word's meaning. He seeks to reveal the underlying form that would make the term applicable to all relevant instances. In the Euthyphro, for example, the question is not just what is piety, but what is the essential nature of piety that makes any pious act pious. Euthyphro initially proposes a straightforward answer: piety is what the gods love. But Socrates presses the definition, asking whether the good of piety exists independently of the gods' love, or whether it is the gods' love that confers piety on actions. The question pushes beyond a convenient usage toward a universal standard that could ground piety in itself rather than in the caprices of divine command. The elenchus is not satisfied with a plausible label. It seeks a ground on which the label could consistently be applied to all relevant cases. And what is the aim? The elenchus seeks stable norms, norms that can be justified by rational demonstration and can guide action. It is not enough to hold a belief that appears to endure in conversation. The belief must be anchored in a form that does not crumble upon closer scrutiny. Thus the elenchus leads not to victory in argument, but to a more robust sense of what counts as knowledge. The aim is not the triumph of persuasion, but the discovery of a credible standard that orders particular judgments and defends them against counterexamples. In this sense, the method mirrors the spirit of mathematical proof, a line of reasoning that must be defensible at every step because it rests on an objective horizon of intelligibility. Two concrete demonstrations of the elenchus in action illuminate how the method works in practice. The first occurs in Euthyphro, where Socrates presses Euthyro's claim to know what piety is. Euthyro's initial definition, piety is what the pious man does in suing his father, appears to crystallize a common-sense sense of piety as dutiful action toward the gods. Socrates challenges this by asking whether the definition covers all pious actions or only a subset, and whether piety can be defined in terms of what the gods love. The crucial move is the elenchus turning point. The famous dilemma: is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because the gods love it? The first option implies that piety exists independently of divine approval, while the second suggests piety is merely the gods' decree. Either way, the initial definition fails to capture an essential feature and invites further refinement. The elenchus thus exposes the inadequacy of the first attempt and compels a re-examination of the concept itself. The result is not a finished, universally accepted answer in that moment, but a turning within the conversation toward a more rigorous inquiry about the necessary conditions of piety, the relation between piety and justice, and the question of whether a universal standard can ground religiously informed virtue. The second demonstration is found in Meno, where the elenchus operates in a different key. Meno begins by asking whether virtue can be taught. The conversation soon slides into a tangled web. If virtue is teachable, then there must be a form of knowledge that yields virtue. If virtue arises by habit, it cannot be taught as such. If it is knowledge, then there must be a method to impart it. Socrates responds with a radical move. He introduces the theory of recollection, arguing that the soul, having knowledge of all things from past incarnations, must recollect what it knew when it encounters new experiences. The elenchus here serves to test Meno's initial presuppositions about learning and knowledge. It turns the question inside out. Rather than seeking a simple, teachable art of virtue, Socrates suggests that virtue is a form of knowledge or true belief that can be brought to light through proper inquiry. The exchange raises a critical problem. If knowledge is recollection, then the process of learning is not straightforward instruction, but a guided remembering that requires a particular kind of dialectic to bring latent knowledge to the surface. The elenchus in Meno therefore functions as a two-layer operation. First, it probes the initial claim about the teachability of virtue. Second, it opens a path toward a deeper account of knowledge through recollection, a route that is both epistemological and methodological. Two further demonstrations of the elenchus, though not always framed as tests in the same sense, show the method's limits or ambiguities. In the early dialogues, we see moments when the elenchus stalls or reveals a problem that cannot be easily resolved within the terms of a single definition. Consider the scene in which Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus speak in the house of Cephalus in the Republic's first books. Each speaker offers a definition of justice, Cephalus's plea for the advantages of a life lived in honor and wealth. Polemarchus's version that justice is rendering to friends what is owed and to enemies what is due. Thrasymachus's brash claim that justice is the advantage of the stronger. Socrates does not calmly accept any of these formulations. He interrogates their assumptions, tests them against counterexamples, and shows that each definition, when pressed, collapses into a problem of principle. The method thus reveals not just a flaw in a proposition, but a structural difficulty in making a universal claim about justice as such. The limit here is not merely a failure to reach an immediate agreement, but the realization that justice, as such, may resist a single, simple formulation that survives all possible tests. The elenchus exposes the complexity of normative concepts and the need to proceed with caution and humility. A second ambiguity arises in the context of virtue and knowledge, where the elenchus reveals a tension between getting a definition that can be consistently applied and rising to a form of knowledge that transcends particular judgments. If the ultimate aim is to reach a universal standard of truth, the dialogue must confront the possibility that no finite list of traits can exhaust the essence of a concept as broad, living, and contested as justice or virtue. The elenchus therefore becomes a ground on which we can either ground a sustainable theory or recognize the need for a higher-order inquiry that transcends simple definitions. In that sense, the method is both liberating and intricate. It liberates the mind from comfortable but inadequate beliefs, while simultaneously forcing it to confront the possibility that the best account of something like justice may require a form of metaphysical or epistemological structure that is difficult to articulate in a single definition. But to speak of the method purely in terms of tests and definitions is to miss the deeper experiential dimension of the dialogues. The elenchus is not only a cognitive exercise. It is a way of inviting us into an entire way of seeing. In Euthyphro, in Meno, and in the early books of the Republic, the method invites the interlocutor and the reader to participate in a disciplined practice of asking, reflecting, and reformulating. The aim is not to trap someone into a corner, but to guide the mind toward a more exact sense of what it is trying to define, toward a more precise understanding of the field in which a concept operates. The elenchus is thus a kind of philosophical training. It makes the mind become more careful, more aware of the assumptions it carries, and more capable of pursuing a goal that is not merely personal victory, but a shared rational standard. The dialogue as literary philosophical form, how form shapes inquiry. If the method is the engine, the dialogue is the vehicle. Plato's early dialogues do not present philosophy as a mere system of propositions. They present philosophy as a living, dramatic conversation. The form itself teaches a version of the method. It shows not only the steps of reasoning, but the conditions in which reasoning takes place. In the dramatic scenes, we encounter the real-time struggle of minds trying to reach agreement, the awkward pauses when a crucial distinction has not yet been grasped, the moments of illumination when a hidden premise is brought to light, the sense of a common goal, truth, that drives the participants onward. The dramatic form invites readers to participate in the inquiry, to feel the tension between competing claims, and to see how a robust defense of a claim depends on more than clever rhetoric. It depends on the ability to articulate a precise standard that can withstand scrutiny. In the early dialogues, we can see the genesis of a literary philosophical technique that Plato will refine in later years. The dialogue can be read as a record of a method in action, but it is also a crafted literary instrument with its own purposes. The scenes are not merely raw transcripts of a talk, they are carefully shaped to bring out patterns of thought. The characters Socrates, Euthyphro, Crito, Meno, and others are not random voices but devices that carry different moments of the inquiry. The dramatic arrangement helps to reveal the method's strengths and its blind spots. It offers a pedagogical model for how a community of inquirers might pursue an end that is not merely personal insight but shared, transferable knowledge. The reader is invited to observe the process, to judge whether the interlocutors have arrived at a secure result, and to reflect on the conditions under which a definition can be regarded as adequate. The core early dialogues, Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Meno, Phaedo. The core early dialogues, which establish the program of Platonic inquiry, are not just introductory pieces. They lay down the threefold path that Plato will pursue in various depths: the examination of pious action and its grounds, the ethical and political tests of virtue, and the movement toward the soul's immortality and the nature of reality. Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, Meno, and Phaedo together chart an arc from the ethical and epistemic questions of everyday life to a more metaphysical view of reality and the soul. In Euthyphro, the central scene concerns piety and impiety, the definitions by which religious conduct is judged. When Socrates asks, "What is piety?" Euthyphro offers a definition that ties piety to acts that please the gods. Yet the elenchus quickly reveals a problem. If piety is simply what pleases the gods, then what makes one act more pious than another? The Euthyphro dilemma, the question of whether the good is loved by the gods because it is good, or good because the gods love it, pushes the inquiry beyond the surface of religious ritual into the underlying ground of moral value. Plato, through Socrates, makes clear that religious ceremony by itself cannot ground an enduring standard of virtue. There must be a standard that holds even when the gods disagree or when men differ about their affections. The dialogue closes with a recognition that the search for piety is a search for an essential quality, a form of goodness that can ground the next acts of piety. In Apology, the trial and defense of Socrates become a dramatized laboratory for the ethical and epistemic questions that underwrite the elenchus. The unyielding commitment to truth, the refusal to compromise with conventional opinion, and the willingness to accept death rather than abandon inquiry reveal a radical stance, the formation of a life devoted to the examination of beliefs. The famous claim is not merely a boast. It is a declaration that the life of the mind, grounded in reason, has a value that exceeds the city's measuring rod of success. When Socrates asserts the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living, he articulates a criterion by which a man can measure the quality and seriousness of his own life. The dialogue thus becomes a testament to the ethics of inquiry, to seek truth even when the social climate of a city condemns the pursuit. Credo adds another dimension, the proper relation between an individual and the laws that organize the political community. Socrates' refusal to escape from prison after the death sentence has been pronounced is not merely a personal decision. It embodies a philosophical stance about the authority of law, the commitments of a citizen, and the consequences of one's actions for the life of a city. The elenchus in this context is not a series of rapid questions but a patient defense of an ethical principle, the obligation to abide by the rules of the political community, even when they threaten one's life, if the rules have been duly established and accepted by the community. The dialogue thereby broadens the scope of the method. The aim is not only to clarify moral concepts but to test one's obligations within a political framework, to show how a life of inquiry must be coordinated with duties to others and to the common good. Meno, with its famous recollection argument, marks a shift toward a theory of knowledge that merges epistemology with pedagogy. The dialogue begins with a practical question about virtue's teachability, yet it becomes a philosophical meditation on what it means to know something and how learning occurs. The elenchus exposes the tension between belief and knowledge and invites a larger answer. Perhaps virtue is a kind of knowledge or true belief that can be made into knowledge through proper inquiry, a process in which the mind recalls what it already knows. The cross-examination pushes Meno to reframe his understanding of inquiry and learning, turning a practical question about education into a metaphysical and epistemological inquiry about the nature of knowledge itself. The elenchus thus acts as a bridge between practical life and theoretical inquiry, suggesting that the best manner of understanding virtue is to understand the nature of knowledge and the way belief becomes justified. The Meno dialogue thus lays the groundwork for the Academy's later exploration of knowledge as a form of stable, genuine understanding. Phaedo unfolds the questions of the soul, of immortality, and of form in the context of a philosophical narrative that takes place on the day of Socrates' death. The dialogue presents the last hours of a thinker who has devoted his life to the discipline of inquiry and the defense of a rational view of reality. The argument for the soul's survival after death, the critique of the senses as unreliable sources of knowledge, and the ascent from the cave of perception to the realm of the forms all show how Plato moves beyond the ethics and epistemology of the earlier dialogues toward a more systematic metaphysics. The Phaedo shows that the method continues to be a live and dynamic practice, one that can sustain the mind in the face of death, and that can provide a coherent account of the nature of reality beyond the changing phenomena of sense experience. The dialogue's final vision, one of the soul's return to the eternal forms, presents the culmination of a long process in which the elenchus and the search for definitions become the instrument for a more comprehensive picture of knowledge and existence. The Academy's legacy, from form-centric to substance-centric horizons, our picture of the Academy has to be both precise and expansive. Founded around 387 BCE, Plato's Academy is more than a school. It is a living experiment in how rational inquiry can be organized, taught, and pursued across generations. In its early phase, the Academy embodies a strong emphasis on geometry and mathematical training as part of philosophical education. The methodological inspiration drawn from geometry, proofs, models, demonstrations, and the insistence on clear, logically independent steps becomes a model for philosophical argument. The mind, like a geometric figure, is to be traced with careful strokes. The argument, like a geometric construction, must be complete and coherent from first principles to final conclusion. This mathematical flavor shapes the manner in which questions are framed, definitions tested, and the ascent toward higher truths organized. The historical record suggests that the Academy was not a single, sterile office of proof, but a living community that included some of the most acute mathematical minds of the time. Figures connected with the Academy, Theaetetus, Eudoxus, perhaps others in the circle, brought with them a taste for rigorous demonstration and a sense that philosophical questions should be approached with the same patient discipline that mathematical theorems demand. The Academy's mathematical culture thus becomes not merely an application of numbers to philosophy, but a structural model for how to think about form, proportion, and universals. The geometric method functions as a paradigm for reasoning, a pattern in which the mind moves from intuitive beginnings to rationally justified conclusions. The Academy thus invites a close alignment between mathematical clarity and philosophical depth, a combination that later thinkers will carry forward in different ways. As time passes, the Academy's orientation shifts in significant ways. the institutional life of the school eventually gives rise to a tradition of inquiry that is not merely supportive of a particular doctrine, but is skeptical by design, critical by necessity, and patient by temperament. This is evident in the later development known as academic skepticism, where the claim to certain knowledge is tempered by the insistence that the senses and even the most confident beliefs should be subjected to ongoing doubt. The academy thus does more than preserve Plato's method. It becomes a living laboratory for testing the boundaries of certainty and for imagining alternatives to the simplest, form-centric accounts of reality. The later figures associated with the academy, including Arcesilaus and Carneades, mold a culture in which philosophical inquiry remains rigorous but becomes more wary of dogma, more attentive to the structure of argument, and more attuned to the complexities of how human beings actually come to believe what they believe. In this sense, the academy helps to translate a form-centered approach, often associated with the early Platonic system, into a more robust, processes-based approach to knowledge, cross-references, and connections. A network of ideas to see Plato's work in a larger philosophical network helps us to appreciate the originality and depth of his project. Parmenides and Heraclitus, with their competing visions of being and becoming, push Plato to ask what kind of reality can ground knowledge that is stable across the flux of ordinary experience. The Pythagoreans, with their noble impulse toward form and harmony, push Plato toward a metaphysical theory of forms as the eternal, unchanging essences that give sensible things their intelligible pattern. The later critique by Aristotle foreshadows a significant move, the shift from form-centric reflection, where the form is often the primary locus of explanation, to a substance-oriented analysis that demands a robust account of how things are constituted in the world and how knowledge of them can be justified through empirical and explanatory interrelations. We can hear this tension in a number of ways. In Plato's own dialogues, the forms provide a robust framework for explaining why sensible things share stability and unity, even as they admit that our sense-perceived world is only a rough, imitative version of that apex of reality. Yet Aristotle, looking back at this lineage, emphasizes the need to ground knowledge not only in the form but in the causal structure of things, the way their essence is embedded in matter, as well as the way form acts in conjunction with matter to produce what we perceive. The subsequent philosophical tradition bears witness to this tension. The method of Elenchus, the emphasis on rigorous inquiry, and a narrative form that invites the reader into a shared practice in the academy are all legible in later currents. They can be seen in different guises, in the way Aristotle insists on demonstration, the way the Stoics cultivate a discourse of rational discipline, and the way medieval and modern philosophers revisit questions about the nature of universals, the status of necessary reasoning, and the possibility of objective norms in a world of changing appearances. In this complex genealogy, Plato's project remains a constant reference, a reminder that the deepest questions, what is real, what is good, how can we know anything at all, can be pursued through disciplined, collective inquiry, through a tradition in which the mind learns not by mere accumulation of facts, but by an ongoing, collaborative search for understanding. Real-world applications and modern interpretations, what does a 5th century BCE conversation about piety, virtue, knowledge, and the good have to offer to a 21st century audience? The answer is not to translate Plato into a set of simple rules, but to invite a practice of life in which questions are not avoided, and where the quality of one's reasoning matters as much as, if not more than, one's immediate conclusions. In modern education, the dialectic approach of the academy resonates in how we structure seminars that prioritize argument, evidence, and reflective critique. The idea that we can arrive at stable norms that can be defended, used in ethical decision-making, and shared across communities, echoes in current debates about scientific reasoning, legal argumentation, and public discourse. The method offers a model of intellectual humility. To claim that we know something, we must be prepared to justify it against counterexamples, to recenter if the justification demands it, and to be ready to revise our beliefs in light of better reasons. In contemporary discourse, we can also glimpse the academy's influence in the ongoing tension between theory and practice. The idea that philosophy should not be merely a rhetorical display, but a life-guiding practice informs debates about the purpose of education, the role of universities, and the project of public reasoning. The Euthyphro dilemma still travels through moral philosophy, as modern ethicists and theologians continue to ask whether moral standards are grounded in a divine command or in a standard that exists independently of any deity. The cross-pollination with mathematics is not merely historical, it remains a living aspiration for how to organize thought. Geometry, proof, and logical structure are still valued as the scaffolding of rigorous argument in many areas of inquiry. The Academy's legacy thus reveals itself in the way we value method, clarity, and intellectual courage when confronting stubborn questions about the good, the true, and the nature of reality. Two further modern interpretations illuminate how readers continue to engage with Plato's context, life, and method. One interpretation emphasizes the dialogic form as a democratic ideal. The belief that through conversation, a community can arrive at shared commitments that govern life and policy. This reading highlights the social and political dimensions of philosophical inquiry. Not a private theater of the mind, but a public practice that bears on how a city or a nation makes judgments about justice, governance, and the common good. The other interpretation emphasizes the metaphysical horizon inside the dialogues. A belief that there exist enduring structures of reality, accessible to reason through careful argument and disciplined education. In this view, the Academy's influence persists in the conviction that philosophical training should include an exposure to mathematics, logic, and abstract reasoning, as well as to the ethical and political questions that shape human life. Examples and analogies to illuminate the method and its consequences to feel the force of Plato's context. One can imagine two practical examples that echo the elenchus and its aim. First, consider a contemporary ethics seminar in which a group is trying to define a principle such as fairness. One participant suggests that fairness is treating like cases alike. The facilitator, following the elenchus, asks, what would count as a case that would violate this principle? If we allow distinctions based on circumstances, do we still have equality of treatment? The conversation stretches not toward a quick consensus, but toward a more precise formulation of fairness that anticipates exceptions and clarifies the scope of application. The participants are moved not to win an argument for their own view, but to refine the concept in light of possible counterexamples. That is how the elenchus operates in communal life. It trains reasoners to search for a standard robust enough to guide action across many scenarios. Second, imagine a field of scientific inquiry undergoing a crisis of interpretation, a debate about whether a particular phenomenon should be explained by a new theory or by an extension of an existing one. A philosopher-scientist might apply a Platonic approach by asking what the core definition would have to entail for a theory to be credible. What would count as adequate evidence? What would a correct deduction require? What would the form of the explanation look like? The elenchus here becomes not merely a mind game, but a live methodological workshop in which terms are clarified, definitions sharpened, and arguments tested against foreseeable objections. The aim remains the same: to discover stable, coherent grounds for belief. In both examples, the spirit of the Academy, discipline, rigor, and an insistence on definition, shapes the inquiry, guiding participants toward a shared standard that can endure scrutiny. Historical anecdotes that illuminate the aims and stakes. Two vivid anecdotes anchor the narrative and help us feel the stakes at work. The first is the trial and execution of Socrates, a story that is as much about a city's fear of disruption as it is about a man's philosophical stubbornness. The charges of impiety and corrupting the young reveal a politics that fears the power of relentless questioning. Socrates, in his iconic manner, refuses to yield to the pressure to conform, insisting that it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, and that a life without examination is not worth living. The trial dramatizes a central question: can philosophy survive in a political community that confuses the demand for social cohesion with a demand for unexamined convention? The execution, far from silencing inquiry, becomes a symbolic triumph of the value of philosophical life, even as it marks a decisive end to Socrates' immediate presence in Athens. It is a historical anchor for Plato's conviction that inquiry must have its own community, its own space, its own continuity beyond the life of a single man and a single public moment. The second anecdote concerns the founding of the Academy around 387 BCE. Plato develops not merely a new school, but a new way of sustaining a disciplined inquiry across generations. The Academy exists as a formal institution with a garden, a study hall, and a curriculum in which geometry, mathematics, dialectic, and ethical reflection are all interwoven. The environment fosters a rhythm of study and debate that is less the exhilaration of a single debate in the agora and more the patient apprenticeship of minds. Consider the effect of a mathematics-tinged approach to philosophy. Proofs, demonstrations, and structural reasoning become the backbone of argumentation, while the content, questions about justice, knowledge, and the nature of reality, receives renewed mathematical discipline. The mathematical and geometric culture of the Academy shapes its approach to inquiry, guiding students to see pattern, proportion, and form as the organizing principles of thought. In this light, the Academy's legacy is not only the transmission of a particular doctrine, but a tradition of reasoning that treats philosophy as a rigorous craft, one that can be practiced, taught, and refined across time. Cross-references to thinkers and currents, the lineage and the reception to situate Plato inside a larger intellectual map is to acknowledge both influence and critique. The early dialogues bear traces of Parmenides' insistence on the unity of being and the danger of relying on perceptual appearances, while they also take up Heraclitus' challenge about becoming and the unreliability of appearances. The famous Heraclitean line, "You cannot step into the same river twice," resonates in Plato's insistence that the world of appearances is moving, but the world of forms offers a higher level of stability and intelligibility. The Pythagorean sense that form and order underlie reality remains a persistent thread in Plato's elaboration of the theory of forms, where the good, the beautiful, and the just are more than names for particular things. They are universal realities that give shape to the things we experience. Aristotle, writing later, offers a crucial counterpoint. He suggests that the shift from form-centric to substance-centric analysis, where form reveals its own relationship to matter and cause by unfolding a robust explanatory mechanism, foreshadows a move away from the idealist orientation in which forms dominate explanation. The critique is not merely negative. It offers a shift in perspective that makes it possible to understand how knowledge grows through empirical engagement with the world, how causes are identified, and how the unity of form and matter works in concrete situations. The later Academy, as it moves into skepticism, shows how the ancient tradition becomes self-aware about the limits of certainty, about the need to maintain a dynamic, open-ended inquiry that can accommodate doubt without surrendering the aspiration toward truth. These cross-references are not idle. They show Plato's role as a bridge between a certain pre-Socratic originality and a broader, ongoing philosophical conversation that extends into the subsequent tradition. They remind us that the Academy's method is not closed. It invites engagement with a long line of thinkers who both borrow and critique, who both preserve a living sense of inquiry and push it toward new horizons. The last chapters. A contemplative arc toward a comprehensive vision to close this segment of our exploration. Consider the arc of Plato's project as one that begins with the immediate color and texture of late classical Athens and ends, in a sense, with a universal horizon accessible through disciplined inquiry. It begins with Socrates in the streets, questioning, provoking, and challenging the city's accepted wisdom. It moves through the formalization of that inquiry into a school, the Academy, where rational method becomes a way of life and a way of training for citizenship in a rational republic of inquiry. It expands in scope from ethics and epistemology to metaphysics and politics, as the dialogues push toward a theory of the forms, a vocabulary for the good, and a critical framework for thinking about how communities should organize themselves and how rulers ought to govern. Throughout, the elenchus remains the signature method. It is the instrument for assessing beliefs, testing definitions, and seeking norms that hold across the variety of human life. It is the method that, in the right hands, can turn a simple question into a doorway to greater clarity, a single exchange into a collaborative ascent toward truth. The dialogues teach us that the life of inquiry is not the same as simply having an opinion that one happens to hold. It is a life that invites others to challenge, refine, and share the sense of what counts as reasoned, justified belief. The Academy, in carrying forward this method, becomes a living invitation, a place where minds can gather, where questions can be asked with patience, where definitions can be teased apart with care, and where the pursuit of virtue, knowledge, and the good can be pursued in a manner that acknowledges both the limits of human certainty and the possibility of genuine understanding. If we listen to Plato with the Attic still in his voice, and perhaps even with a modern ear, we hear a call to cultivate the habit of deep, careful thinking in a way that respects the complexity of reality. The context, Athens in the late classical period, the life and trial and death of Socrates, the birth of an institution that would shape the practice of philosophy for centuries, gives the work its texture and its urgency. The life of Socrates becomes the seed, the Academy the greenhouse, and the dialogues the living, growing vines that carry forward questions about the nature of reality, the ground of value, and the means by which we might come to know anything at all. In this sense, the history is not a mere sequence of events, it is a living pedagogical project. It is a continuous invitation to every thinker who reads or hears these words to enter into a practice of thoughtful, patient, shared inquiry, the practice of philosophy as a way of living well within a community that is willing to subject itself to the question. In the end, Plato's context, life, and method are never simply about a man, a school, or a set of doctrines. They are about a continuous, vigilant attempt to hold together two commitments that can seem at odds. The demand for universal, knowable norms and the humility to acknowledge how difficult it is to anchor those norms in a world of change, disagreement, and complexity. The elenchus remains the instrument through which this tension is explored, tested, and refined. The academy remains the arena in which the long practice of reasoned inquiry is cultivated. The dialogues remain the record of a living practice, dialogue as method, method as practice, practice as a way of life. And as we turn from this segment into the upcoming discussion of the later dialogues and their own expansions of the conversation, we recall the twofold heritage we have traced. A historical origin in late classical Athens that turns a master of questions into a living method, and a future that would widen the scope of inquiry toward metaphysical depth and political clarity. Plato's context is thus not only a historical topic but an invitation to consider how a city's questions can become a school's disciplines, how a single man's questions can foster a shared life of intellectual risk, and how the search for truth can become a communal art that shapes not only ideas but the life of a city and its people. This is the enduring meditation of Snooze philosophy in the Plato section. A patient, reflective turn toward questions whose worth remains even after the last word is spoken. A reminder that to inquire is, in a real sense, to live as if the world could still be known more truly than we presently know it, and that the mind, when disciplined in the right company, can become a compass for navigating the mysteries of existence. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a room filled with things that catch your eye. The beauty of a sunset reflected on the calm surface of a lake, the symmetry of a well-made statue, the justice you feel in a fair decision, the order you sense when a city runs with prudence and restraint. Now imagine that beneath all this multiplicity there lies a deeper, steadier pattern, an order that does not come and go with the changing shadows of the sensible world. In Plato's imagination, that steadiness is not merely a dream or a hypothesis, but the very structure of reality itself. There are eternal, perfect forms or essences behind sensible objects, and particular things are imperfect copies that participate in or imitate these forms. This is the heart of what we call the theory of forms, a theory that also serves as an epistemology, a politics, and a pedagogy, all braided together in a single, demanding vision. First, let us ground ourselves in the core metaphysical claim. Plato asks us to suppose that there exists a realm of being that is not subject to the flux and decay we witness in the everyday world. In that realm, forms or essences are eternal, ungenerated, unchanging, and perfectly beautiful or just or good in themselves. These forms are not mere ideas in someone's mind or conventions of language. They are the intelligible realities that give shape and necessity to all the things we encounter in the sensible sphere. A cup is not merely a pot made of clay. It participates in the form of cupness, or more precisely, in the form of a certain essence that makes cup the kind of thing that cups can be. Take beauty as a paradigmatic example. A thing is beautiful not by accident or mere preference, but by sharing in the form of beauty itself. A painting, a sunset, a person's moral integrity, a single form of beauty appears through many appearances, and our experiences of beauty are our minds grasping or reflecting that form, not merely accustoming our senses to pleasing phenomena. To translate this into a living sense of epistemology, Plato introduces a distinction between two kinds of reality and two kinds of knowledge. On the one hand, there is the world we can sense with the eyes, which is full of changing appearances, and on the other, a world that remains constant, intelligible, and accessible through reason. The sensible world is the world of opinion, belief that is not yet tethered to knowledge. The intelligible world is the world of knowledge, grasped through dialectic and illuminated by understanding. The transition from opinion to knowledge is not merely a matter of more data, it is a transformation of the mind's relationship to reality itself. The key tool for this transformation is the ascent from the visible to the intelligible, an ascent Plato dramatizes through the allegory of the cave and through the divided line in the Republic, and he anchors the deeper claim about the soul's knowledge in the Phaedo and the Timaeus. Let us begin with the divided line, which in the Republic offers a map of knowledge versus opinion, and then turn to the cave later as a more narrative pedagogy. The divided line sets up two terrains. The visible realm and the intelligible realm, each subdivided into two segments. On the left, in the visible part, we have imagination or fantasia, eidolon or ikasia, depending on translation, and belief or opinion pistis. On the right, in the intelligible part, there is thought or reasoning, diania, and understanding or knowledge, gnosis. The lower segments correspond to images, reflections, and conjectures, things that a child or a novice might know through sense and habit. The higher segments correspond to the forms themselves, grasped through reason, and then through dialectical assent to the form of the good, which illuminates all the rest. The divided line thus functions as a pedagogical map. You begin with images, then move to belief about copies, then advance to theoretical thinking about pattern and cause, and finally arrive at the grasp of the form as such, and in the famous culminating move, to the form of the good as the cause of intelligibility. In this portrait, mathematics and geometry play crucial illustrative roles. The forms have perfect, timeless existence. The mathematics we learn in geometry points toward a discipline of exactness that the senses cannot themselves master. When a student learns to derive a geometric oddity from a postulate, they are not merely memorizing a recipe. They are training the mind to abstract from changing particulars to universal relations that do not vary with the object. Plato's favorite example is the line between the right triangles, or the proportion of the sacred and the holy, how the properties of a triangle remain with us in all contexts, how the whole is known by the unity of its parts, how the circle's perfect ratio remains constant. The point is not that geometry is a mere schoolboy toy, but that geometry demonstrates, by its very structure, the possibility of knowledge that is not based on sense experience alone. Geometry, with its necessity and universality, makes visible the possibility that there are endpoints of inquiry beyond the shifting world of appearances. It functions as a microcosm of a larger philosophical claim. The mind can ascend from flux to fixed form, from opinion to knowledge, by moving toward intelligible patterns that structure the sensible world. Let us also ground this transition in the soul's movement as Plato narrates it in the Phaedo, and then link it with the cosmic architecture described in the Timaeus. In the Phaedo, the dialogue opens with the philosopher in dialogue with his friends on the eve of his execution, arguing that the soul is the thing that truly understands, and that knowledge precedes experience because the soul has, prior to birth, encountered the forms in the realm of the intelligible. The famous claim that the soul recollects what it already knows, if we can but bring it to light, is presented as evidence for an initial state of knowledge before habitual sense experience. The argument unfolds through the theory of recollection. The mind, when guided by dialectic, recalls the perfect forms it once knew when it stood in the presence of those forms. The ascent, then, is not a purely empirical climb. It is a philosophical recollection that requires the soul to depart from the sensory distractions and to re-enter a realm where the forms are grasped by understanding rather than by sight. In the Timaeus, the story of the cosmos embodies a different dimension of the same assumption, that the world as a whole is a living, rationally ordered entity, crafted by a divine craftsman who imprints rational structure onto matter. The world is a single, intelligible organism, whose parts, be they celestial bodies, the four elements, or the human soul, reflect the same underlying forms. The cosmic order thus grounds the claim that form is not only a property of individual things, but a principle that organizes the entire sensible universe. The Timaeus invites us to view the world as a coherent whole, in which the forms are the patterns that govern both micro and macro levels of being. That is why mathematics appears again as a guiding light. The regularity of planetary motion, the harmonic proportions of the cosmic scale, the geometric symmetry of natural forms, all of these offer a model for how the mind can come to know order by beholding the arrangements that surpass any particular object. Hybridizing these strands, Plato's central claim is that we can understand the forms through a process of ascent, a turning away from the distracting surface of appearances to the stable core of reality. Truth, for him, is not a mere accumulation of sensory data. It is an encounter with essences that are themselves intelligible without reference to any particular time or place. The form of the good, then, is not simply the brightest form among many. It is the source of intelligibility and value, the principle that allows the other forms to be known and evaluated. If the other forms are like the stations on the divided line, then the good is the light that makes knowledge possible, the sun that allows a mind to see form as form rather than as mere shade and color. The allegory of the sun in the Republic is central here. As the sun makes objects visible to the eye, the good makes the forms visible to the mind, and through its light the mind can discern both truth and the good life. Having sketched out the metaphysical landscape, let us turn now to the allegory of the cave, a narrative you may know as a dramatic, accessible illustration of how minds ascend from illusion to understanding. In the cave, prisoners live in a world of shadows cast on a wall by puppets and objects that pass in front of a fire behind them. The only reality they know is the flickering silhouette of appearances, the images that reach their senses. These prisoners mistake shadows for the true world. If one of them were freed and brought into the sunlight, he would initially be dazzled by the brightness and would resist the new reality. Gradually, as his eyes adjusted, he would come to see the world as it is, the objects themselves in their forms, not merely their shadows. And if he were to go further, he would come to recognize the sun as the source of light and life, and most importantly, as the cause of knowledge in the realm above. The ascent for the cave dweller is the ascent from illusion to knowledge, from belief in mere appearances to understanding of the true form of reality, and finally to a vision of the good that makes sense of all the others. But the cave is not a mere fiction for its own sake. It is a pedagogy, a story about education and the political implications of knowledge. The ascent is not a solitary pursuit, it has civic consequences. The person who has seen the light must return to the cave to help others, even if this return places him at risk. The philosopher-king idea emerges from this motive. If one possesses knowledge of the good, of the right order of the city and the soul, one has a duty to govern for the sake of the whole community, not for personal advantage or mere rhetorical success. The cave as pedagogy thus serves not only epistemology but political philosophy. It asks us to consider, what is the measure of the good life and who is fit to lead a city toward it? Is it the person who sees the world as it truly is, or the clever operator of appearances who controls the narrative? Plato's answer, as we can sense, is the former, with the cave as a mirror that asks us to test our own relations to knowledge, power, and responsibility. To understand the full texture of these claims, we must consider several layers of argument and several lines of critique. The first and most famous of the objections comes from Aristotle, Plato's student, and the most formidable systematic thinker to come after him. Aristotle's third man argument is a challenge to the very structure of the forms as distinct from particular objects. The line of thought goes like this: if a form F is instantiated in many particular F objects, then the F objects themselves are similar in virtue of sharing a form. But then there must be a fourth thing, the form of the F form itself, which is again a form that explains why many instances share F, but if you continue this logic, you spiral into an infinite regression, or you end up introducing an additional form to explain the similarity of forms. A third man that seems to require another form to explain why the forms are alike, and so on. The result is not just a technical nuisance, it threatens to detach forms from their natural connection to concrete objects. Aristotle's worry is that forms, if they are separate eternal entities, might seem detached from how things actually work in the sensible world. How, he asks, could a form cause or explain the existence or behavior of a particular thing in space and time? If the form is separate and abstract, what is its causal power to bring about a change in material things? A related line of critique follows from a worry that has persisted through the Christian, medieval, and modern periods. If forms are too detached from concrete objects, how can they play a causal role in the senses? In the Platonic account, the aim is often to show that sensible things participate in or imitate forms, and that we come to know not by sense but by intellectual assent to the forms themselves. But the more we stress the independence and stability of the forms, the more distant they seem from the dynamic, changing world of perception. The worry is not only metaphysical but practical. If knowledge is knowledge of a realm so removed from experience, how can human beings, embedded in a finite world, ever engage with it meaningfully? The cave, after all, is a story about learning through a translation of perception into reason, and then into action. If the objects of our knowledge are remote or only accessible through dialectical assent, what becomes of common life, of civic decision, of the everyday governance of a city? There is also a modern line of critique from nominalists, fictionalists, and anti-essentialists. If the form of beauty or justice is a real thing and not merely a useful linguistic fiction, then one might still ask, what is the ontological status of these forms in light of our best scientific theories? Do we need forms if talk of universals seems to be reducible to linguistic conventions or to the spatio-temporal arrangement of particular things? The nominalist might insist that universals do not exist independently of our language and classification schemes. The fictionalist might say that statements about forms are useful fictions that help us navigate the world, but do not track a real, extra-empirical essence. The anti-essentialist might push further, arguing that what we call the form is not a single, immutable essences, but a cluster of conventional, context-sensitive patterns that shift with culture and inquiry. In that sense, the very claim to timeless, perfect forms loses some of its force when confronted with modern science and philosophy of language. Yet these challenges are not simply demolitions. They also open fertile ground for reinterpretation and transformation, as we shall see in the later Platonist currents, especially the Neo-Pythagoreans and the Neoplatonists, who attempt to preserve an insistence on unity and assent while reframing forms in a more dynamic, hierarchical cosmos. Before we move deeper into those reconstructions, let us pause to anchor a few historical anecdotes that enrich our understanding of the forms, the mathematics, and the academy as an institution. The ancient Greek world was a culture in which mathematical thinking held extraordinary prominence, not as an abstract curiosity, but as a central method of inquiry about order, proportion, and the nature of reality. In the workshop spaces of philosophers and mathematicians, geometry was not just a practical craft. It was a way of training the mind to discern necessary connections, to get beyond the variability of matter to the invariance of form. The academy, founded by Plato, was a place where geometry and dialectic walked together. It is easy to read Plato as if he were proposing a purely contemplative ascent, but the historical texture reminds us that mathematical thinking had a lived, communal life in the school. The culture of the academy included both rigorous geometric demonstration and an interest in harmonizing science with philosophy. Mathematical thinking thus served as a powerful instrument for illustrating how form and measure can govern both the natural world and the moral life. The anecdotes here are not just about proofs. They are about an educational ethos in which the discipline of reason, the delight in order, and the aspiration to see beyond appearances coalesced in a shared project. A second historical strand concerns Neo-Pythagorean and early Neoplatonist interpretations that reframe forms within a more expansive framework of unity and emanation. The Neo-Pythagoreans kept alive the sense that numbers, ratios, and harmonic principles governed reality, and they pursued the idea that the soul's ascent to knowledge might train through a reinterpretation of mathematics as a path to the intelligible realm. The early Neoplatonists, notably Plotinus, reinterpreted the forms in a hierarchy of being, the one, the intellect, and the world soul, that preserves Plato's insistence on form and on ascent, but situates the forms within a more metaphysically dynamic system in which emanation and return describe how the many know the one. Augustine, drawing on Plotinus, would later fuse these currents with Christian thought, retuning the language of forms into a framework of salvation history and teleology, while preserving a sense that the most intelligible reality lies beyond ordinary experience. In these later traditions, the forms do not vanish. They transform, becoming more anchored in a cosmology of ascent and, in some versions, of the soul's longing to return to its source. The lineage from Plato to Plotinus and Augustine is not one of simple reproduction, but a living conversation about how to understand universals, how to account for the coherence of experience, and how to connect knowledge with virtue and love. Now let us weave cross-references that enrich the meditation. Aristotle's metaphysics is the most explicit and rigorous alternative in the ancient tradition. In that corpus, we meet a philosophy that questions the very need for separate forms as a realm of their own. Aristotle's hylomorphism, substance as the union of form and matter, offers a way to think about form as a principle that actualizes matter rather than as a separate, objective thing above it. The relation between form and matter is not one of disengagement but of codetermination. The form is what organizes matter, and the matter is what receives the form in a given instantiation. This makes the question of causal efficacy central to Aristotle's account. If the form is a separate, eternal object, can it be the cause of change in the physical world? Aristotle's response would be that form is not separate in the same sense. Form is the organizing principle within substances, and causality is a matter of efficient causes among actual things in the world, not the participation of an abstract form in a separate realm. The third man argument is a famous challenge to the grammar of forms in Plato's system, pointing toward a potential regress and a desire to ground universals in something that can be cashed out in terms of sensible objects rather than in separate, independent entities. In modern philosophy, Kant's distinction between noumena and phenomena acts as a critical intervention that reshapes how we tell the story of appearances and essences. Kant asks us to recognize that our knowledge is always filtered through the structures of the mind, the categories, the space, the time, the ways in which we organize experience. The forms, in Plato's sense, would be those eternal essences that stand behind appearances. Kant would concede something like the regulative idea that guides our understanding, but insists that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, except as they appear through the mind's filters. The sense in which Kant splits the world into noumena and phenomena transforms the project. The ascent is not simply toward a realm of unconditioned reality, but toward a disciplined understanding of what we can know and how we know it. In the long arc of history, the Platonic commitment to ascent, gradual self-transcendence of the mind, finds new forms, new locations, and new terms, but the core longing remains. To say that there is more to reality than what we immediately sense, and that there is a rational path to that more. In Plotinus and Augustine, the form is reimagined within a metaphysical ladder that preserves the pull toward unity, order, and the good, but translates it into a language of ascent toward the one or toward God, rather than toward an abstract set of forms in a separate realm. The Platonian system thinks of the One as the ultimate principle, beyond even being, from which all forms emanate and to which all things return. The calculus of knowledge, therefore, becomes a journey in which the soul, through contemplation and purification, moves closer to unity with the source of all form and intelligibility. Augustine, absorbing these currents, situates the ascent in a teleological frame of Christian faith and grace, where knowledge of the forms may be understood as a movement toward God's truth, and where the city itself is to be governed in light of the good as a fulfillment of divine law and love. The lineage from Plato to Plotinus and Augustine is not a simple replacement or a denial, but a transformation. It preserves the core insight that there is more to reality than appearances, and that the mind has a capacity to apprehend patterns and essences that exceed the sensible world, while reframing that ascent in terms of a higher, transcendent source of reality and value. And yet we must not erase the practical horizon. The Republic, the Cave, and the Phaedo are not dust-covered curiosities. They are living reflections on education, inquiry, and politics. The form of the good has not only epistemic significance but political potency. If there is a form of the good, then there is a standard by which to judge laws, institutions, and policies. The philosopher who knows what is best for human flourishing will be able to discern justice as such, and to see how the many institutions of law and governance can be aligned with the higher good. The allegory of the cave is a meditation on pedagogy and leadership. It asks who has the responsibility to lead, how to educate those who have never contemplated the higher order, and whether the city should be governed by those who know or by those who merely know how to manipulate opinion. The political implications of the form of the good thus become a central piece of the whole argument. It is not enough to know, one must know well enough to guide others toward a life of true understanding and just action. To ground our discussion with concrete exemplars, consider two detailed examples of forms and two demonstrations of epistemic assent. The first example is beauty as a form. Beauty is not a trait of any particular painting or person alone. It recurs across diverse objects and contexts. A sunset, a sculpture, a dancer in motion, a person with a virtuous character, all can bear the mark of the form of beauty insofar as they instantiate the perfect pattern. The beauty of a flower in spring or the proportion of a well-built building may be different in their surfaces, but behind them lies a unity that surpasses those differences. In this sense, beauty becomes not merely a sensory impression, but a rational standard by which to measure and compare. What makes this moment of perception beautiful is its alignment with that higher form, which is stable and universally recognized by a mind trained in dialectical assent. The second example is justice. Justice is not the set of rules a city manager obeys or a set of social norms that keep peace. It is a form that determines the right proportions of parts within the soul and of the parts within the city. In the soul, justice means each part performing its proper function, reason ruling, governed by the object of desire and the appetites, each in their right place. In the city, justice means a harmonious arrangement of rulers, guardians, and producers, each performing their proper role in accordance with the form of justice that informs the whole. These forms are not contingent habits, but universal patterns that tie together particular instances into a coherent whole. Their beauty or their justice is not exhausted by their appearance in any single case. What makes them forms is that they can be recognized across diverse contexts, and their recognition requires a disciplined training of the mind. Two demonstrations of epistemic assent deserve special emphasis. The first is the ascent from sense to opinion to knowledge within the practical pedagogy of education. In the divided line, we see a staged ascent, from images to belief about copies, to thinking about causes, to knowledge of the form, and finally, to the good. The ascent is anchored in disciplined inquiry, not in passive observation. The process resembles the philosopher's method in dialectic. We start with particular cases, visible phenomena, test them against one another, extract from them a pattern, and then push beyond pattern to the underlying cause or principle. The progress is not linear in the sense of a single arrow. It is a staged practice, requiring patience, dialogue, and exposure to the reasons that justify beliefs. It is best illustrated, perhaps, by a student who begins by admiring a beautiful sculpture, identifies the common elements among several beautiful objects, abstracts the shared form of beauty, and then, trained by conversation and argument, comes to see why this form constitutes the basis for the judgments of beauty in a wide range of cases. The mind thereby travels from the particular to the universal, from the surface to the essential, and from opinion to knowledge. The second ascent is the soul's journey described within the Phaedo, which can be read as a preparatory map for the ascent to knowledge in the Republic. Here the ascent is tied to the idea of recollection. The soul has known the forms prior to birth and retrieves that knowledge through dialectic. The argument for recollection relies on the unity between what we see and what we know, the remark that learning is not the introduction of something new into the mind, but the awakening of what the soul already possesses. This is not simply a psychological claim, but a metaphysical one. The ascent begins in the soul's memory and proceeds with philosophical questioning that discloses the forms through reason. In the Phaedo, the soul's ascent is framed as a preparation for the afterlife, but the epistemic structure, recollection under guided inquiry, offers a model for how the mind can attain truth through disciplined inquiry, even while remaining in the context of a human life. There are two more layers to illuminate: the practical epistemology of practice and the modern reinterpretations that help connect Plato to present concerns. The epistemology in practice, as Plato envisions it, is not simply a matter of intellectual assent, but of educational transformation, what it takes to cultivate a mind capable of discerning form. It is a pedagogy of dialectic, of challenging assumptions, of guided questioning by a teacher who knows what the good is and how to lead the soul toward it. It involves a sequence of disciplines that together form a citizen capable of judging not only what is technically true, but what is morally and socially right. The cave becomes a classroom, a way to show the student that the world of appearance can distort judgment and that the antidote is knowledge, which comes through training, discussion, and the courage to confront discomfort. The ascent is not a solitary voyage, but a communal practice that requires doctrinal humility, a readiness to revise one's beliefs in light of reason, and a willingness to bear responsibility for the city one inhabits. As for modern challenges, there are responses and activations that keep the conversation alive. One path is to retain the core claim that there are patterns and principles that guide experience and action while reframing them in ways that respond to contemporary concerns. The nominalist, fictionalist, and anti-essentialist critiques push us to rethink what we mean by form, essence, and universal. They invite us to consider how a robust account of form can be compatible with scientific theory, language games, and social constructions without collapsing into mere convention. The response is not to abandon the core insight that there are enduring patterns in nature, but to locate them within a more dynamic and interconnected system of knowledge, one that allows for historical development, cultural difference, and the role of interpretation in shaping our access to truth. In this sense, Plato's forms may become, for modern readers, not a stubborn metaphysical architecture, but a call to cultivate a disciplined, reflective, and ethically oriented form of inquiry that remains relevant in an age of skepticism about universals. To connect with other thinkers in the tradition, consider how Kant's noumena/phenomena distinction reframes the problem. Knowledge is not of things in themselves in Plato's sense, yet we still have access to a structured world through the mind's forms of intuition and categories. The unity of the forms from Plato persists in the sense that the mind's structure discovers order, even if the order is not the same as the Platonic form. Then there are Plotinus and Augustine, who begin with the same longing for unity and illumination, but transpose the language into a richer metaphysical and spiritual frame. Plotinus's one is the ultimate source of unity, from which the intellect contemplates the forms, and the world's soul brings order to the cosmos. Augustine's Christian synthesis is a reminder that even when we translate these questions into a monotheistic framework, the attraction to a knowledge that transcends sense remains central. The movement from a world of appearances to a higher order remains an enduring lure for thinkers across centuries. Finally, let us offer guidance for expanding this exploration into practice and discussion, and for expanding the material to a longer, immersive script suitable for a video that invites viewers to think with serenity and curiosity. A section on epistemology in practice could begin with a guided dialogue exercise. Consider a modern phenomenon, justice in public policy, the beauty of a public park, or the integrity of a corporate decision, and ask how one would identify the form behind these phenomena. What counts as evidence for the form of justice in a contemporary legal system? How might one structure a conversation that moves from opinion about fairness to a principled understanding of justice as a form that unites a community? The exercise would require participants to move step by step through the divided lines ladder, from images and anecdotes to beliefs about copies, from reasoning about causes to genuine knowledge of the form, and finally to a judgment about the good that can guide policy. The cave as pedagogy could extend to an on-the-ground design for classrooms or public institutions, a curriculum that foregrounds dialectic, dialogue, and reflection on the moral and political purposes of knowledge. The aim would be to cultivate citizens who are not merely clever at debates, but wise enough to see the good and to act in light of that understanding. The form of the good and political implications deserve their own sustained chapter in any serious treatment. The good as the source of intelligibility and value, frames political life as a project of aligning institutions with the deepest principles that matter for human flourishing. Plato's answer to the political question is not a blueprint for a perfect republic, but a demand that the just city will be governed by those who know the high aim of human life, who can discern what justice entails in the long run, and who can resist the temptations of power for its own sake. The philosopher king is, in this sense, a physician of the city, diagnosing a city's ills and prescribing remedies grounded in a psychology of virtue and a metaphysical conviction about the order of reality. Critics might push back by asking how such a knower could avoid becoming despotic, or how to reconcile a hierarchy of knowledge with democratic values. Plato's replies in the dialogues emphasize a balance. The guardians are not to rule as tyrants, but as stewards who hold the city in the light of the good, always mindful of their own limits and the need for rational persuasion rather than coercive power. In modern terms, the project translates into a political philosophy that prizes education, deliberation, and a shared commitment to the common good, an agenda that remains surprisingly resonant for those who worry about the divergence of expertise and public responsibility. In exploring the critiques from subsequent philosophers, one can see how the conversation continues in new keys rather than closing in on itself. Aristotle's objections keep the door open for a difference between universals and particulars that is not simply a matter of abstract separation, but one of explanatory power in a natural order. Kant's critical turn reframes the project by acknowledging the indispensability and the limits of human cognition in shaping experience. The Neoplatonists recast the ascent in terms of emanation and return, while Augustine's adaptation places the entire inquiry under the sign of divine truth and salvation. Across these movements, the central questions persist. Can there be a mind that truly knows the world as it is in itself? Can there be a form of the good that makes life and knowledge intelligible? What is the relationship between knowledge and virtue, between theory and practice, and between the universal and the particular? The responses are varied, but the impulse to see through appearances to a deeper order endures. As a final meditation before we close this reflection, consider the way in which Plato's thought invites us to cultivate a stance of humility and courage. Humility, because to acknowledge that the senses mislead and that the mind's ascent requires guidance is to admit the limits of ordinary perception. Courage, because to pursue the ascent involves leaving the familiar and potentially challenging the foundations of habitual belief. Yet the reward is not escape into an ivory tower, but a more reliable guide for living with justice, beauty, and truth. The forms, understood as patterns and principles that order reality, offer not an isolated metaphysical fiction, but a living grammar of experience. The good is not simply a theoretical postulate, but a practical ambition. To cultivate a life in which the mind is able to see rightly, to judge well, and to act in ways that foster human flourishing. If you have walked with me this far, you have taken a slow, patient journey through a tradition that insists that there is more to reality than what we can immediately sense, and that the mind, trained in dialectic and disciplined by inquiry, can come to know that deeper reality. You have heard the claim that there exist eternal forms behind sensible objects, that the good is the source of intelligibility and value, that the divided line maps the ascent from opinion to knowledge, and that the allegory of the cave offers a narrative of education and political responsibility. You have seen how mathematics and geometry serve as illustrations of form, how the soul's recollection in the Phaedo can be read as a prelude to a wider epistemic ascent, and how the Timaeus's cosmology gives a cosmic scale to the unity and order that the forms exemplify. You have encountered meaningful counterarguments, from Aristotle's third-man argument to concerns about causal efficacy and contemporary critiques from nominalist or anti-essentialist traditions, and you have traced a lineage that extends from Plato through Plotinus to Augustine and Kant, to the modern moment where debates about universals, epistemology, and the nature of reality continue to matter. In the quiet that follows such an inquiry, you may find yourself drawn back to the cave, not to remain there, but to re-embrace the ascent, to test your own judgments against the light of reason, and to consider the ways in which your life, your community, and your world might be ordered more generously by the forms you may come to know. The journey is demanding and the road is long, but the payoff is a mind that is not merely clever in the art of argument, but a mind that can inhabit a shared sense of truth, beauty, and justice. This is the promise and the burden of Plato's theory of forms, a call to see beyond appearances, to inquire with patience and courage, and to hold fast to a commitment to the good as the ground of knowledge and life together. If you would like to go deeper, we can unfold particular dialogues in more detail, reading specific passages from Republic, Phaedo, and Timaeus with careful attention to the terms and their translations, and we can juxtapose Plato's claims with Aristotle's criticisms, Kant's critique, Plotinus's metaphysical assent, and Augustine's Christian reworking. We could also design a sequence of guided exercises for classroom or self-study that echo the ascent through the divided line and the cave, incorporating modern examples that test the claim about forms in areas such as science, law, and ethics. We could append a glossary of terms: form, participation, gnosis, pistis, eikasia, the form of the good, the sun as analogy, the divided line, the cave, recollection, the soul's immortality, the cosmology of the Timaeus, and pair each term with suggested discussion prompts and further reading. And we could outline a companion video segment that explores the Neoplatonist reinterpretations, the medieval meditations on universals, and the modern philosophical reactions that reshape the reception of the forms, all the while keeping the thread of ascent, education, and political responsibility in clear focus. If that direction would be useful, tell me which strands you'd like to foreground, and I'll tailor the next segment to your preferred emphasis and pacing, keeping the same calm, reflective tone that invites listeners to linger with these enduring questions. Tonight we turn toward a question that sits at the very heart of Plato's Republic. What would politics look like if it were truly an extension of ethics and metaphysics, if the city itself and the soul alike could be organized in just and harmonious order by those who grasp the deepest realities of being and the good? In this section we walk with Plato through a vision of politics that is not merely a program for governance, but a contemplative exercise in how to live well together, under a law that seeks not merely order but the unity of virtue. The Republic does not begin with practicalities alone. It begins with the most intimate of questions. What is justice, and how would a city be ordered if justice had to be lived out as a form of harmony rather than as the mere absence of chaos? To approach this, Plato constructs a city in speech that mirrors a soul, and then asks us to discern whether harmony at scale can be achieved without sacrificing the freedom and dignity of those who compose it. Plato begins in a way where ethics and metaphysics meet, by insisting that justice in the city is a reflection of justice in the soul. If we are to understand political order, we must first understand the order of the soul itself. He translates a philosophical ascent into a social architecture. The city becomes, in a sense, the larger soul as the forms become more legible when stretched across a population rather than contained within an individual. The Republic treats the city as a living diagram for what a human life could become when one is governed by knowledge of the good. The project emerges from a conviction that the ascent from appearances to the intelligible requires a social setting favorable to reason, a community that fosters virtue from childhood onward, a training that aligns desires with truth. And because the aim is neither mere efficiency nor mere custom, but the cultivation of genuine goodness, the result will be something that resembles a work of art, a harmony achieved not by accident but by the deliberate shaping of character and institutions. To understand the architecture, imagine a city that is divided into three distinct classes, each with its own proper function, each with its own education, each with its own share of rightly ordered pleasures and duties. The three-tier city is not a mere administrative diagram, it is an ethical hypothesis about the nature of human beings and the shape of social life. The rulers, the guardians, and the producers, the last being farmers, artisans, merchants, and everyone who supplies the city with the goods and services it needs to sustain life. The rulers, who in this framework are philosophers, are the intelligible center of gravity. They are not philosophers in the sense of bohemian dreamers detached from the grit of daily life. They are those whose souls have climbed the ladder of knowledge, who have laid hold of the form of the good as best as a human being can, and who possess the practical prudence needed to translate that knowledge into wise governance. The guardians, the second class, stand between the rulers and producers. They are like the armored sentinels whose courage keeps the city safe, whose loyalty to the common good tempers personal ambition, and whose education trains them to carry out the plans of the rulers while maintaining the emotional discipline necessary for a stable polity. And the producers, the farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and laborers, are the bedrock of material life, the part of the city that must be allowed to pursue its crafts, its commerce, and its daily labor without being drawn into the philosophical quarrels that belong to ruling. This triadic structure is not arbitrary. It embodies a conviction about the nature of virtue and the distribution of expertise. The rulers must know what is good not merely as a moral sentiment, but as a principle that grounds all the other goods of the city. The guardians must know what is dangerous in the soul and in the city, and their courage must be disciplined by a deep loyalty to the common interest. The producers must pursue the necessities of life with temperance and steadiness, so that the city can rest on a foundation of shared labor and mutual respect. In Plato's terms, the city becomes a microcosm of the soul. Each part has its proper role, each part harmonizes with the others, and justice arises when each part performs its own function without overstepping its bounds. The line is drawn not merely between rulers and ruled, but between a life governed by knowledge and one governed by appetite or fear. The city, he asserts, is the soul writ large, and the soul, if properly educated, becomes the city that can harmonize desire, belief, and action into a single, coherent life. The moral and metaphysical rationale for this ordering does not rest on sentiment alone. It rests on a view of knowledge and reality that has been traced through Plato's most fundamental claims about the forms, the good, and the nature of being. If the good is the cause of knowledge and the source of reality for the intelligible realm, then those who know the good are those who can govern not merely for immediate advantage, but for the enduring flourishing of the whole. To entrust rule to those who possess such knowledge is to align political power with the deepest intelligible structure of reality. Yet, since knowledge of the good is itself a form of love, a form of truth that requires assent, the city must be designed to cultivate that assent in others. The education of the guardian, and especially the education of the philosopher king, is not a mere curriculum. It is a long initiation into the life of the mind, into a way of seeing the world that makes possible the right ordering of desires and resources. The education that Plato prescribes is at once rigorous and costly. It begins with the most elementary capacities, physical training in music, stories and poems, arithmetic and geometry, and then, through a sequence of dialectical exercises, culminates in the examination of the form of the good itself. The early education in music and poetry is not incidental. It forms the moral atmosphere of the young soul. It shapes what one loves, what one fears, what one hopes. The aim is to mold desire toward noble ends and to train it away from dangerous imitations. This is where the Republic introduces its controversial but central instrument, censorship of art. Plato argues that certain stories and depictions, especially those about the gods and heroes who do not reveal the moral seriousness of the city or who encourage pride, must be kept from the moral education of the young. The poems and dramas that suggest gods behaving capriciously, or that celebrate the vices of the speakers, threaten the harmony of the city because they unsettle the foundations of virtue, stirring up passions that are not yet under rational control. In a republic oriented to the common good, art must serve moral education rather than simply indulge aesthetic appetite. The philosopher, after all, must be the one who guides desire toward true goods, not toward seductive appearances that may seem attractive in the moment, but corrode the long-term health of the soul and the polity. This raises a question that Plato anticipates with calm seriousness. What is the right balance between freedom and order? If education is the ladder by which one ascends to political knowledge, then to pull away a rung of this ladder, say, by silencing dangerous stories, might be thought necessary for the good. Yet to do so would also seem to limit the freedom of the young to encounter moral and epistemic challenges. The tension here is not incidental. It is a central hinge on which Plato's entire political ethic rests. The aim is not to suppress opinion for its own sake, but to cultivate a form of educated freedom that remains tethered to the good. The noble lie enters this discussion as a way to secure unity when the ascent to knowledge must be prepared by a shared conviction about the nature of the city and the role of each class. The noble lie is not a deception to corrupt the citizens for personal gain. It is a carefully crafted tale designed to sustain social harmony by making citizens believe that their place in the city is part of a larger, just cosmic order. The metal-based caste system, in which some are declared gold, others silver, and others bronze or iron, is not a mere political fiction. It is a pedagogical device meant to anchor a stable order in which each class accepts its role as part of a larger rational plan. The noble lie, Plato suggests, can be a vehicle for moral education if it is framed as a trust placed in the guardians, who have the duty to shepherd the city toward the good. But this is a dangerous device, and Plato does not pretend that its use would be simple or unproblematic. The moral weight of lying for the sake of justice is a question that would trouble any age. Education, censorship, and communal arrangements of property and family figure in Plato's design as instruments that help to implement justice as harmony in the city and the soul. The guardians do not own property in the ordinary sense. They share resources to prevent the excessive attachment to wealth that might corrupt their loyalty to the common good. The family structure, likewise, is reimagined so that the bonds of affection do not become a source of faction or private interest that would pull guardians away from their duties. A startling corollary of this approach is that the city would be a model of communal life, in which private family ties and private property give way to a shared life oriented toward the common good. The aim is not to abolish love or family as such, but to prevent private interest from fracturing political unity. Justice, in this sense, is not merely the normal functioning of institutions. It is a way of ordering love so that they contribute to the good rather than undermine it. The three-tier city, with its education and its carefully guarded boundaries between classes, serves a deeper metaphysical purpose as well. The rulers must understand the forms, not merely the appearances of social advantage. They must know what counts as true greatness in the most robust sense. The ability to judge rightly about the ends of life, the kinds of pleasures that are authentic, and the kinds of goods that endure. The guardians must protect the city as if it were a living body they could feel with a soldier's heart, disciplined and loyal. The producers must cultivate the arts of life in which the city depends on their labor to sustain its material needs. The aim is to ensure that every person contributes to a whole whose vitality is greater than any single part. The city thus offers a picture of justice that is not merely a negative of avoiding harm. It is a positive structure of good in which every element knows its own share of the work. To illustrate how Plato moves from a general theory of justice into concrete practices, let us examine two central, detailed examples from the Republic that have resonated through centuries of political thought. The first is the cave-like pedagogy that trains the rulers. The second is the myth of the metals that secures social unity and the acceptance of a rigid class structure with a moral justification. Together, they show how the ascent to wisdom and the maintenance of social order are imagined as inseparable tracks within a single philosophical pedagogy. The cave is not a mere metaphor for ignorance. It is a vivid description of how the educated life must begin, proceed, and culminate. In the early books of the Republic, Socrates and his interlocutors elaborate a pedagogy that begins in the ordinary world with the plain, visible things around us. The shadows on the wall, the images in stories, the taken-for-granted beliefs about what is valuable. The process gradually moves from the visible to the intelligible. The ascent is painful, requiring difficulty, discipline, and a willingness to leave behind familiar comfort. The person who has lived all her life in the cave becomes aware that the shadows are not the things themselves. They are images of forms, copies of realities that are more real than the appearances. The ascent from the cave is thus not a private journey of enlightenment, but a social transformation of the individual in the service of a higher common good. The moment of ascent comes when the soul is exposed to the light of the sun, the form of the good, and recognizes that what is true and knowable is not arithmetic of appearances, but something that can be grasped in the light of reason. Plato's imagery is not only philosophical, it is a political ecology of education. The city must be structured so that the souls most capable of this ascent are cultivated from childhood, protected from the seductions of power and wealth, and given a path of study that brings them to the rational vision necessary to govern justly. The allegory of the cave thus becomes a practical blueprint for a political project, and the cave teaches us something essential about legitimacy and authority. When the ruler is made, by education and inquiry, to see the good, he becomes fit to rule, not by force or by the incentives of fear, but by the desire to bring the light to others. But the ascent is not a solitary achievement. It is a social achievement, made possible only because the city has provided a structure of education that can produce those who have looked beyond shadows and are willing to live for the truth rather than for power or status. The cave illustrates why the philosopher is the best, and perhaps the only, legitimate ruler in Plato's view, because only the lover of truth can recognize why a just city must be ordered in prudence, courage, and wisdom, not merely for the sake of social stability, but for the sake of the good that underwrites reality itself. The myth of the metals provides a second, equally consequential instrument for social unity. In the Republic, the city's harmony is not to be built on the mere consent of the governed, or on the language of consent and rights as we might put it today. Instead, it rests on a narrative, one that serves to align each citizen's sense of place with the larger structure of the city's good. The myth of the metals is introduced to answer a pressing practical problem. How can a city of diverse talents, needs, and desires be kept from fracturing into factions, from the cunning that seeks advantage, from the pride that seeks to rule others? The myth claims that every person is born with a particular metal in his or her soul. Those of gold are fitted to be rulers, those of silver to be guardians, those of bronze and iron to be producers. The core claim is that the metals correspond to natural differences in ability and temperament, and that this natural stratification, if rightly recognized and publicly acknowledged, will make social unity intelligible and credible. The noble lie tells citizens that their place in the city's order is not just a social preference or a political compromise. It is a cosmic necessity, a truth that resonates with the deepest patterns of nature. This is a moment of remarkable ethical tension. If the unity of the city depends on citizens believing a myth about their own nature, does that not risk manipulating the most basic judgments that govern their lives? Is not politics then a matter of persuasion, of shaping belief, of securing obedience through a shared myth, rather than through the rational assent of free citizens to the reasons for their shared life? Plato does not shy away from this issue. The myth is justified by its intended outcome, the reduction of social conflict and the alignment of desire with the good. If the meta narrative helps to extinguish faction and directs each class to accept its role as part of a larger rational design, the city can avoid the constant destabilization of conflicting ambitions. Yet the myth's power also makes it a potential instrument of tyranny, if wielded by rulers who would adjust its content to protect their own power rather than to promote genuine justice. The noble lie, then, is double-edged. It may stabilize a fragile order, but it also creates a vulnerability that the guardians and philosophers must guard against by always linking the lie to a rigorous moral aim, and to the education that aims at true knowledge rather than at blind obedience. In addition to these two central examples, Plato's Republic advances a number of concrete proposals that have been reinterpreted and debated through the centuries. One such proposal concerns the education of women. If the guardians are to uphold the city's order, Plato argues, then women who share the same nature as men must be educated for the same roles if they prove to have the same aptitude. The Republic contains a surprisingly bold assertion for a classical text. The soul's capacity does not depend on the accident of sex. Women, if they are physically and intellectually capable, should receive the same rigorous education as men, and if worthy, should be eligible to join the guardian class, even to become rulers if the nature of their souls aligns with the demands of philosophical ruling. This is not a minor digression, but a central instrument in the city's logic of justice. It is an attempt to remove a hereditary prejudice that would have constrained the moral and political order by ruling out potential excellence simply because of gender. Plato's stance on gender, controversial then as now, is a genuine attempt to test whether the city could be organized around the truth of political virtue rather than the tradition of social division. It provides an early meditation on equality of opportunity and the conditions under which such equality could be meaningful in a political life. There are at least two detailed historical and textual touches that illuminate how serious Plato takes these educational experiments with gender and the guardianship of the city. First, the text explicitly imagines a form of education designed to unlock capacities that are often thought to belong exclusively to men. If a woman possesses the same natural aptitude for leadership and philosophy as a man, then she should share in the guardian's education, and if proven fit, should occupy the same civic responsibilities. This is not a mere rhetorical flourish, but a serious proposal about the scope and demands of political virtue. Second, the text treats the gatekeeping of the soul's formation as a matter of public policy. The issues of communal property and the suppression of private families are not incidental features, but fundamental to ensuring that the guardian's loyalties remain with the city rather than with private households. In other words, the Republic's stance on the education of women and on communal arrangements is not a side note. It is a core piece of the architecture that makes the city's justice thinkable as a lived experience rather than an abstract doctrine. Let us now turn our attention to two kinds of counterarguments that have haunted discussions about Plato's political vision from antiquity to the present. The first cluster of objections concerns feasibility and the risks of tyranny. How could a city possibly be ruled by those who have learned the good, while still preserving any genuine sense of liberty for its citizens? Critics have pointed to the logical and practical gaps. Knowledge of the good may not suffice to govern the many who are ruled, even if the rulers possess it. The distance between theoretical knowledge and the art of politics is wide, especially when political life demands compromise, responsiveness to new circumstances, and empathy with the diverse people who live in the city. The risk of tyranny lurks in the very idea of a ruling elite that is authorized to determine the common good. If the guardians and rulers also possess a monopolistic education that others do not have, what remains of political equality or of the fair opportunity for dissent? The noble lie compounds this concern. If a city's unity rests on a fabricated cosmology that legitimates a rigid hierarchy, the line between persuasion and coercion becomes dangerously blurred. In an historical moment when regimes claim to guard virtue while silencing disagreement, the Platonic model becomes a cautionary tale about how much truth should be entrusted to a specialized ruling class. A second set of criticisms centers on fears about liberty, creativity, and inequality. Some readers argue that Plato's city would reproduce or even intensify the very injustices it seeks to overcome. If the general will is identified with the rational will of the guardians and the philosopher kings, is there not a danger that dissenting voices, those who question the premises of the city's own rational plan, will be repressed? If property is communal and marriage institutions are rearranged to prevent private interest from undermining social cohesion, does that not stifle the ordinary liberties by which people cultivate personal identity, family life, and the individual's sense of purpose? And if the governance of virtue is entrusted to a small class, might not the city become a kind of rational tyranny, where liberty is transformed into a matter of compliance with a tacitly agreed-upon rational authority? The Republic does not pretend that these questions yield comfortable answers. Rather, it offers a rigorous examination of the trade-offs involved in any political arrangement that seeks to ground legitimacy in epistemic authority and moral education. The broader argument, and this is where the conversation becomes historically rich, concerns the problem of implementing such a system in a real polity. Plato writes in a moment when Athens is contending with its own fragilities, when democracy has produced both heroic acts and catastrophic failures, and when the city is exposed to the fatal pulls of faction and power. It is not an accident that his negative portrait of democracy is embedded within a broader critique of the city's moral psychology and of the fragility of the social bond when not anchored in a robust theory of the good. The Republic's proposals for a ruling elite are thus both a response to specific historical conditions and an exploration of the limits of political possibility. The question remains: can an ideal governance founded on philosophical knowledge translate into feasible forms of political life in any age, including our own, in which information, wealth, and power often concentrate in unforeseen ways? As we consider the practical implications of Plato's thought, we should recall two historical anecdotes that illuminate how far his ideas traveled, often in ways his own authorship might not have anticipated. The first concerns the collapse of Athenian democracy and the political upheavals that followed. Athens, the cradle of Western political thought, experienced the devastating effects of its own democratic experiments, including the fatigue of a city at war, the moral and political corrosions that accompany factionalism, and the vulnerability to demagogues who could sway crowds with persuasive rhetoric. In the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Athens faced internal strife and the eventual ascendancy of oligarchic power during the brief rule of the 30 tyrants. Socrates himself was executed in a climate of political crisis, and Plato's own reluctance to remain within a democracy that would condemn him or his mentor yields to the more cautious, philosophical stance that characterizes the Republic. This anecdote, Socrates' trial and death, the oligarchic upheavals that followed, and Plato's own withdrawal from Athenian political life, provides the historical texture that helps us understand why the Republic is not only a philosophical treatise, but also a political reflection born out of a city's crisis. A second anecdote concerns the long-term influence of Platonic political theory on medieval Christian thought and early modern utopian writings. The medieval world, in various strands of thought, drew heavily on Platonic and Neoplatonic reservoirs. Christian thinkers such as Augustine, drawing on a Platonic vocabulary, reimagined the city of God as a transfigured republic in which the moral order is ultimately ordered toward the divine. The tension between the earthly city and the heavenly city in Augustine's City of God shows a Platonic resonance. The idea that human political life is a testing ground for virtue, a place where philosophy can illuminate the path to the good, even if the final horizon lies beyond the reach of any one city. In the early modern period, more radical utopian imaginations took up the Platonic challenge to reimagine political possibility. Thomas More's Utopia, Campanella's City of the Sun, and Francis Bacon's New Atlantis echo the sense that ideal political orders may be imagined as perennial critiques of the actual arrangements of power. These texts are not straightforward replicas of Plato. They are dialogues with Plato, reworking his questions in fashionable modern frames. They show how Platonic questions about justice, the role of ruling knowledge, the education of citizens, and the pursuit of the common good become a persistent gravitational center for debates about political legitimacy, the meaning of liberty, and the feasibility of ideal forms of government. But Plato's influence did not disappear in these centuries. Aristotle appears as a decisive interlocutor, a thinker who both inherits and challenges part of Plato's program. In the Politics, Aristotle adapts the general intuition that cities are graded by the virtue of their citizens, but he resists the leap from an ideal city, grounded in knowledge of the good, to a workable program for governance by a select few. He asks whether a city full of philosophers could exist without degenerating into a tyranny of opinion, and whether the practical demands of life, marriage, property, education of children, the distribution of wealth, could be reconciled with a theory of the best life for humans. Xenophon, in his own dialogues about leadership, also engages with Platonic themes, offering portraits of prudent rulers and virtue in administration that echo the same concerns, but with a more pragmatic emphasis. The later reception of Plato's political theory in the hands of Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Kant is especially instructive. Machiavelli, writing in a post-Grotius landscape where political realism challenges moral idealism, reframes political power as a craft governed by necessity and prudence rather than by metaphysical truth alone. Rousseau reinterprets the social contract through a lens of freedom and the general will, offering a critique of ancient regimes and imagining a way of achieving moral order in a more participatory framework. Kant's perpetual peace anchors a modern, universalist impulse. It is not the private virtue or the ruling genius of a philosopher-king that secures lasting peace, but the formation of republics whose constitutional forms and moral commitments align with the conditions of justice for all. In our own time, debates about ideal versus feasible political theories rest on the same questions Plato raises. Can human beings live under a regime that asks for more than they can give in the name of the good? Is the path from ideal to feasible a path of possible transformation, or is it a dangerous fantasy that suppresses liberty and creativity? To speak with direct historical resonance, it is worthwhile to place Plato contrasts and continuities in dialogue with several major figures and movements across time. Aristotle's Politics provides a counterweight to Plato's ideal city, offering a more pluralistic account of virtue and a more cautious claim about the possibility of achieving a stable polity through the forms of life that citizens naturally adopt. If Plato's philosopher-king embodies the rational ruler who knows the good, Aristotle's best polis remains more modest in its claims about who should rule and what knowledge counts as sufficient for political authority. The tension between an epistemic aristocracy and a political democracy remains a central thread in political theory, and it has echoed into Machiavelli's insistence that political virtue must be judged by effectiveness rather than by spiritual elevation, Rousseau's emphasis on freedom and collective sovereignty, and Kant's insistence on the universal law that must govern the peace of nations. The dialogue among these voices, from Plato to Aristotle to Machiavelli to Rousseau to Kant, and into our present debates about the legitimacy and practicality of ideal versus feasible political theories, is not a mere historical curiosity. It is a living conversation about what politics is for, what it requires of human beings, and what its deepest commitments reveal about our shared humanity. Cross-referencing with these thinkers helps us ask a durable question. Is the Republic's ideal of a city governed by the good a blueprint for reality, or is it a thought experiment that clarifies the deepest stakes of political life? If we see it as a blueprint, we must examine its feasibility, its moral psychology, and the ways in which its very discipline and unity might be turned toward coercive ends. If we see it as a thought experiment, we allow it to illuminate our present political problems, the stubborn problems of education, of the shepherding of desires, of the tension between unity and freedom, of the danger of elites who know what is best but forget what it means to live among many. The Republic's political dream thus remains provocatively alive when confronted by the opposing dreams that have shaped the modern world. It insists that justice is not simply a social arrangement that prevents harm. It is the art of aligning the city and the soul in such a way that every part can flourish in its own right. From this vantage, the Republic also participates in debates about reform and the design of institutions in ways that resonate with contemporary political philosophy. It anticipates the classic liberal challenge to the concentration of power. Can wisdom and virtue be distributed in such a way that the common good is secured without sacrificing liberty? It anticipates the socialist critique that private property and family life generate unequal incentives that must be tempered by communal arrangements, even if Plato's version of communal property and shared life remains controversial by modern standards. It also intersects with the deliberations of political philosophy about how best to structure education to cultivate citizens who can participate in the moral life of the city while also maintaining a critical perspective on authority. The Republic's educational plan, with its insistence on the formation of character as a political end, invites us to consider what it would mean to educate citizens for citizenship themselves, rather than to train a professional class of rulers who can rationally justify the structure of their own power. When we turn to the language of the text, we encounter a set of place-specific questions about legitimacy and authority that feel as urgent as ever. The ascent of the philosopher into political life, the idea that the best rulers would be those who understand the deepest realities of being, raises concerns about how a political order might prevent the alienation of ordinary people who must bear the consequences of decisions made by a class of knowers. If the path to wisdom is a path of exclusion, can the city survive as a democratic community of equals who still respect the expertise of those who have walked furthest along the road of knowledge? And if the city is designed to reward the lovers of wisdom, how do we ensure that wisdom does not become a euphemism for a certain kind of conquest, namely, the conquest of the city by the few who can claim to have seen the form of the good? Plato himself does not surrender to these anxieties. Instead, he presses us to ask and answer these questions in a disciplined way, to imagine institutions, to test them against the possibilities of human life, and to consider what justice would require if the good were not merely an abstract ideal, but a practical law for living together. In recent discussions, these questions translate into contemporary debates about political legitimacy and practical feasibility. The term philosopher king has often been invoked as a symbol of ideal governance, an ultimate test case for whether the best rulers should be the most learned, or whether such a claim would be a dangerous lure toward technocracy or tyranny. The argument splits here. Some argue that governance grounded in reason and virtue, guided by the best knowledge of human flourishing, offers a vision that can inspire public virtue and reduce corruption. Others argue that knowledge alone cannot guarantee just action when political life requires alliances, compromises, and compromises of conscience as one navigates competing loyalties. The question is not merely whether such a regime could exist, but how it could be evaluated. If an ideal of unity and the common good is to be realized within a real political order, it must reckon with pluralism, dissent, and the moral psychology of power. The Republic's insistence on education, the form of the good, and the noble lie all require careful, ongoing reflection about how to keep the city both just and free. In order to engage the broader conversation with other major figures, it is helpful to cross-reference the Republic's core ideas with Aristotle's Politics, Machiavelli's Statecraft, Rousseau's Social Contract, Kant's Perpetual Peace, and ongoing debates about ideal versus feasible political theory. Aristotle, drawing on a parallel concern with virtue and the good life, offers a more grounded approach to political order. He emphasizes the human good as the end of political life and argues that the best regime is the one that educates citizens to the point where moral virtues arise naturally in the exercise of public life. Yet he remains skeptical of the possibility of a city entirely dominated by philosopher kings. He asks, in effect, how we sustain virtue when ordinary people must decide, vote, and participate in a pluralistic world where disagreement is not a mere accident but a fundamental condition of political life. Machiavelli, reading the same landscape from a different vantage, challenges the idea that virtue and prudence are synonymous with a single, ideal form of governance. He is concerned with the reality of power, how it is acquired, how it is kept, and how a ruler should act when confronted with the necessity of success, even at the price of virtue as it is traditionally conceived. Rousseau's political thought pushes in a different direction. He raises the question of freedom and the role of the general will, asking whether a political order can ground liberty in a social contract that binds individuals to a common good that is more than the sum of its parts. Kant's Perpetual Peace project takes a modern, universal turn. It suggests that there is a political form, the Republic, that can contribute to peace among nations if it respects the norms of autonomy, equality, and the rule of law as a universal principle. The contemporary debate about ideal versus feasible political theory, as it is formulated by contemporary philosophers, asks tough questions about whether the grand designs of ancient or modern utopians can be realized within actual states that must answer to the constraints of history, culture, and human fallenness. The discussion about the Republic in dialogue with these traditions helps illuminate the enduring relevance of its questions, even as it invites critical re-examination of its methods and its moral assumptions. Two questions in particular anchor the present inquiry. First, is justice in the city identical to justice in the soul, or can we imagine cases in which social harmony requires a different form of justice than personal virtue? The Republic says yes, the harmony of the city and the harmony of the soul mirror one another, but each has its own constraints and demands. The soul's order is achieved through education and philosophical assent. The city's order is achieved through a carefully organized division of labor and a training regime that aligns desire with the common good. Second, what is the relation between knowledge and power? For Plato, knowledge of the good is the highest form of knowledge and should be the guiding principle of rule. But knowledge by itself does not secure ethical action. if power is not also constrained and directed by moral wisdom that has been tested in the crucible of public life. The Republic thus invites a challenging synthesis. It argues for governance by the wise, but it does so with the caveat that wisdom must be integrated with prudence, with the capacity to respond to human needs, and with the humility to accept the limits of what political life can truly accomplish. This tension, the tension between ideal knowledge and practical governance, has animated political thought for centuries and continues to be a central concern in contemporary debates about democratic legitimacy, technocratic governance, and the possibility of reform that preserves both unity and liberty. As we close this segment, let us carry forward the sense that Plato's Politics, in its Republic, is not a simple manual, but a living, provocative meditation on justice, beauty, and the conditions of a flourishing human life within a shared world. It speaks to the deepest longing to harmonize the soul's longing for truth with the city's need for order. It is a voice that has echoed through the ages. In the Christian medieval councils where city and heaven interpenetrate, in the utopian imaginations of early modern writers who attempt to translate ancient questions into new formats, in the modern debates about the legitimacy of political authority and the feasibility of ideal forms of government. It asks us to imagine what could be if the best we could know about the good were joined to the best we could do in common life. It asks us to consider the cost of such a union, the discipline required, the temptations that accompany power, the risk that unity becomes coercion, and the moral work demanded of every citizen who would live well in a city that is not merely a place to dwell, but a shared vocation to become good together. In this long conversation, Plato's voice remains a steady invitation to pause and reconsider what we think makes a city just, what we think counts as true education for citizens, and what we think it would require for a polity to pursue harmony without sacrificing the liberty and dignity of those who live within it. The questions do not vanish with the closing of the Republic. They intensify as we find new ways to imagine education, governance, and the conditions of a peaceful political life in a world of plural loyalties, rapid change, and enduring human longings for a common good. If we listen with care, the philosopher-king figure can become not a literal proposal, but a persistent symbol, a reminder that the highest politics is, at its best, a disciplined love of truth, and of the life that truth makes possible for us when we live together as free and responsible beings in a shared city and a shared world. The air in this section is never still, even when we imagine it to be, because Plato's thought moves like a living organism. A single inquiry unfolds into a network of invitations. Ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, all braided together in a single life aimed at ordering the soul and discerning the good. In this journey, we will begin with the texture of Plato's psychology, how he understands the soul as a living harmony of powers, and then climb toward the ascent that Eros makes into reality. We will listen for the music of the soul when it is in tune, and we will trace how that tuning relates to the order of the cosmos as Plato conceives it in the Timaeus, where the demiurge fashions a world out of eternal forms and mathematical proportion. Finally, we will turn to the Republic and ask what a city organized by virtue, by right reason made active in law, culture, and education, means for art, poetry, and music. All the while we will return to concrete examples, the Phaedo's immortality argument and the reminiscence myth, the ascent of love in the symposium and the Phaedrus, and the way these stories illuminate the everyday quest to live well. Let us begin with a map of origins. Plato's ethics is not a set of rules handed down from on high, it is the governance of a life. It proceeds from a hypothesis about the nature of the soul and about the nature of reality. If the soul is a microcosm mirroring the order of the cosmos, then the virtue of the soul will be the soul's sound relationship to that order. If the world is a disciplined arrangement of form and matter, then the good life will be the life that aligns with that order rather than colliding with it. In the Republic and the Laws alike, what we might call the ethical psychology of Plato is a drama of ordering, a drama that begins with an inner tripartite life and seeks its outer corollary in a just city. The tripartite soul is not a theory grafted onto human experience, it is Plato's way of naming the different voices that speak within a person. There is the rational part, the part that seeks knowledge, that questions and reasons about what is best. There is the spirited part, the source of courage, ambition, and righteous anger. And there is the appetitive part, the home of desire, appetite, and material longing. In the dialogue of the soul, these parts often pull in different directions, and the moral life consists in achieving a harmonious ordering so that the rational part governs, the spirited part sustains the courage to follow reason, and the appetites are not allowed to override the whole. Virtue in this sense is not a solitary act of will but a structural harmony, like a chorus in which each voice speaks its role but none drowns out the others. This harmony is not a mere balance of forces, but a unity achieved when the rational part understands the good and governs the whole with right reason. The unity of virtue in Plato's more technical sense is the unity of knowledge with action, virtue as knowledge or right reason. If one truly knows what is good, one will do good. If one truly understands the form of justice, the just life will be chosen over the merely convenient or the merely pleasurable. This is not a naive claim that cognitive awareness automatically guarantees ethical action in all circumstances. It is a claim about the deep structure of the soul, when reason rightly contends with desire, and when the passions are disciplined by well-ordered appetites, the person lives in accord with the good. That accord is not only a personal achievement, but a model of political life. A city that embodies harmony among its parts mirrors a soul that has achieved harmony among its parts. Now consider the ascent of Eros in the Symposium, which dramatizes a different aspect of the same ethical physics. Here Eros is not merely sexual longing or a primitive craving. Eros becomes the motor of ascent toward truth. The narrative is a ladder. It begins with love of a single beautiful body and proceeds through successive forms of beauty, body, mind, institutions, sciences, until it reaches the form of beauty itself and finally, with Diotima's help, the form of the good. The ascent is a pedagogy of desire. Desire that is properly ordered does not end with consumption but with illumination, with the lover becoming a seeker of what endures and what perfects. In this sense, Eros is not a distraction from philosophy but its most faithful ally. It is the energy that carries the soul beyond the merely particular and towards the universal. What precisely is this latter? Diotima's counsel is that we should not mistake beauty as beauty alone for the whole of reality. We begin by appreciating the beauty of one body, which awakens a certain regard for beauty itself. Then we pass to the beauty of all bodies, realizing that what we love in each is a common form. From the beauty of bodies, we ascend to the beauty of minds, of laws, of institutions, and finally to the beauty of knowledge and the beauty of the good as such. The crucial turning point is the realization that beauty is not exhausted by a single object, but is a quality that can be found in many things, and most fully in the form of beauty itself, which is the source and unity of all particular beauties. And what is the end of this ascent? Not merely the perception of beauty for its own sake, but the knowledge that beauty guides the soul toward truth, toward the good, toward the form that makes the whole order intelligible. If we ask what is the telos of such an ascent, Plato's answer is that the culminating object of contemplative life is the good. The good is not merely the object of perception, but the principle by which all things are intelligible. To gaze upon the form of the good is to see how the rest of the forms, and indeed the order of the cosmos, lose their mystery when viewed in relation to the good. This is the philosophical apex of the ascent. The good organizes the many into a unity and gives to the many things a law, a measure, a purpose. In an older, more metaphysical register, the good is what makes knowledge possible in the first place. Without the light of the good, the forms remain obscure and the soul flounders in a sea of appearances. The ascent from bodily attraction to the beauty of form, and from there to the contemplation of the good, has a radical ethical implication. It reframes moral life as a discipline of attention. Our loves, if rightly oriented, become ladders rather than traps. If we love the good, knowledge becomes not a distant ideal, but a living form to imitate in our souls and in our communities. The ascent thereby supplies a robust account of moral education. It is not simply about inculcating rules or exhorting discipline, but about shaping the desires so that they longer cling to the particular and transient, but long to comprehend the universal order. In this sense, beauty itself becomes not a luxury but a pedagogy of ethics. How does this connect to the cosmos? Plato's Timaeus supplies a cosmology that ties ethics to ontology, art, and metaphysical anthropology in a single explanatory web. The demiurge, the craftsman of the cosmos, orders matter according to eternal forms and proportion. He uses geometric laws and numerical ratios as the instrument of order, aiming to fashion a world that is intelligible and good. The ethical aim of ordering the soul finds its parallel in the cosmological order. Just as the demiurge imposes order on the chaos to bring forth a world that is good and beautiful, so the soul must impose order on its unruly parts to bring forth a life that is good and beautiful. The world itself is intelligible because it is an image, albeit a rational image, of the eternal forms. The soul, mirroring this architecture, must align with the cosmic order by living in accordance with reason and by cultivating virtue as harmony, harmony within and harmony with the larger order. The demiurge's project is not to create a perfect republic of ideas separate from the world, but to craft a world where rational order is possible, and where beings can participate in the good through participation in the divine rationality that shapes the cosmos. The ethical import is then that life well-ordered, just, temperate, courageous, and wise, corresponds to a world well-ordered. The soul as microcosm enters into a shared project with the macrocosm. Both seek to be governed by proportion, measure, and form. The soul's ascent mirrors the cosmos's own ascent toward intelligibility. If we turn now to the Republic, we encounter Plato's most famous, and perhaps most contested, claim about the role of art and poetry in education. The Republic is a decisive moment in the discussion of art, rhetoric, and education, because it translates the metaphysical and psychological theory into political pedagogy. The city should be engineered to produce souls that are in harmony with the forms and with the rational structuring of life. This means that poetry, especially the imitative poetry that imitates appearances rather than truths, has a potentially dangerous influence. The poet presenting appearances as if they were realities can mislead the soul, disturb its harmony, and encourage fear, appetite, or irrational passions. In this sense, the Republic's critique of poetry is not a simple censorship of art, but a philosophical defense of a particular pedagogy. Art should cultivate the right desire for truth, foster courage and temperance, and train citizens in the discipline of rational discourse. The philosophical motive behind censoring poetry becomes clear when we consider Plato's broader aim: to align the soul with the form of the good, and to educate citizens who can discern truth and act in ways that promote the common good. In a culture profoundly affected by poetry and images, this is a radical claim. That art, left unguided, may misdirect the soul away from reason and toward appetite or spectacle. Yet the Republic's position is not a blanket condemnation of poetry or music. It allows for forms of art that discipline the passions and elevate the soul by presenting the idea of justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom in ways that can be understood and internalized rightly by citizens. The key is the moral supervision of the arts and a pedagogy that uses beauty not as mere ornament but as a route to the good. From this, we can survey the enduring significance of beauty, art, and music within a Platonic framework. Beauty is not merely a matter of taste, it is an ontological and ethical beacon in Plato's account. Beauty discloses the form, reveals proportionality, and invites the soul to participate in a larger order. Art, when guided by philosophical insight, can become a mediator between the sensible and the intelligible, between the particular and the universal. Music, with its rhythm and harmony, is especially potent because it resonates with the soul's own proportions. A melody that is out of tune with reason can unsettle the soul just as a disharmony in a city can destabilize civic life. But a music that trains the ear toward measure and harmony can cultivate virtue by shaping dispositions and habituations. Let us consider some concrete examples that illuminate the architecture of this thought. The first is the Phaedo's argument for the soul's immortality. In this dialogue, we encounter a drama about becoming and being, a philosophical patient patiently watching illusion fall away as Socrates reflects on the nature of soul and body. The argument proceeds through dialogues about opposites. That which comes to be from what is opposite must also be something that ceases. The soul, in driving forth life, cannot simply perish with the body. Rather, it must persist in a form that allows it to undergo rebirth or reincorporation into new life. A second line of argument is the theory of recollection, the idea that learning is essentially recollecting what the soul knew before birth, what it saw when it looked upon the form of the good and the world of eternal truths. This is not a mere claim about memory, it is a theory about the soul's pre-existence and its capacity to recover a knowledge that the senses do not produce. In Phaedo, these arguments are not simply demonstrations. They are dramatic images of a soul that, in order to become educated in truth, must strip away the ignorance that comes from embodiment and return to a state of intelligible presence. The second substantive cluster concerns the symposium and the Phaedrus on love as a path to ascent to truth. The symposium offers a moving portrayal of how love catalyzes the ascent of the soul, while the Phaedrus connects eros with rhetoric and the life of the mind. In the symposium, the ascent begins with erotic attraction to a beautiful body and is ordered toward a broader love of beauty itself. The lover who proceeds through the ladder comes to see that beauty is not only in physical form, but in the beauty of the soul, of dialectic, of virtue, of law, and ultimately in the beauty that lies in the form of beauty. The Phaedrus then repurposes philosophical rhetoric. Rhetoric is not mere persuasion, but the art of delivering truth in ways that align the soul with wisdom. The argumentative arc is that true rhetoric must rest on knowledge of the good and be disciplined by the soul's own order. If rhetoric is used to manipulate appetite or fear, it becomes a dangerous instrument. If used rightly, rhetoric can become a vehicle for the ascent to truth, because it persuades not merely through force of argument, but through the cultivation of desire for the good. Thirdly, the Phaedo's myth of reminiscence presents an epistemic claim about knowledge that broadens the ethical and metaphysical horizon. The soul, according to the theory of recollection, has encountered the forms before birth and has forgotten them only as a result of entering into the body. Learning, then, is the process of recollecting what the soul already knows. This is a radical claim about epistemology and about how we come to know what we know. It also implies a moral claim. The soul's memory of the good, the just, the beautiful, and the true is our compass. The more we draw on that inner memory and align our acts with that knowledge, the more we enable the soul to achieve its own flourishing. The mythic dimension becomes a framework for a practical life. How we live matters because it either awakens or dulls the soul's capacity to remember and hence to participate in truth. Before turning more explicitly to counterarguments, we must sketch how the interplay between ethics and metaphysics appears in the broader history. Plato's thought is not an isolated island. It lies on a river of philosophical development that runs through late antiquity into Christian theology and into the Renaissance. The Neoplatonists, for example, approached Plato as offering a metaphysical system that could be reconciled with a monotheistic, spiritual reading of reality. Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism, preserved the ascent tongue of Plato but recast it in a hierarchical structure: the one, the nous, and the soul. The ascent toward the good is recast as ascent toward the one, the source of all form and order, a move that intensifies the ethical aim of living in accordance with a divinely ordered cosmos. The late antique practitioners transformed the ethical aim of order into a spiritual project, purify the soul to return to the source. Augustine would later incorporate Platonic forms into a Christian framework, reinterpreting the good as God and allowing metaphysical ascent to be resolved in a theological encounter with divine love. The Renaissance revived Platonic aesthetics and mathematics in a way that fused the beauty of numbers, geometry, proportion, and art with a new sense of human potential and civic life. Marsilio Ficino and the Florentine Academy revived the love of the forms in language that would shape the humanist imagination for centuries. These episodes are not a detour, but a demonstration of how a Platonic framework persists by absorbing new questions about the soul, about beauty, about art, and about education into the same problem. How to live well in a changing world. In modern philosophy, the Platonic project also becomes a site of cross-pressures. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics challenges the idea that knowledge alone guarantees virtue by insisting that virtue involves a stable character and practical wisdom. In Aristotle, virtue is a mean relative to us, a balance among extremes, tempered by practical judgment. Thus, even if one knows the good, one may fail in action if one does not moderate worldly appetites through virtuous habit. Plato's claim that virtue is knowledge thus meets a robust counterargument. Knowledge without appropriate habit and feeling can fail to translate into moral action. The modern problem of universals, a worry about the ontological status of forms, also presses against Platonic optimism. If forms are the permanent essences of things, the question becomes how we can know them and how they can be said to exist independently of human minds. The charge of ontological essentialism, that Platonic forms posits a kind of static, absolute essence that can seem remote from lived experience, has been a staple of critique, especially as modern empiricists and later postmodern thinkers question the necessity or feasibility of such universals being independently real. The art and aesthetic side of the equation also invites critique in modern terms. Some argue that separating art from moral influence, or at least imagining that art can exist outside of or independent from ethical critique, risks reducing beauty to mere sensation or politicizing beauty beyond recognition. Others claim that the universality of beauty, this idea that beauty has an objective, shareable standard, remains suspect in a pluralistic world. If beauty is a universal, whose taste is used to adjudicate it? And if beauty can guide us toward truth, what happens when different traditions disagree about what beauty demands or what counts as the good? These modern debates echo the ancient concerns but reframes them with new vocabulary. The question of autonomy and responsibility in art, the possibility of moral education through aesthetic experience, and the place of the spiritual dimension of beauty in a secular age. Yet to think with Plato is not simply to defend or attack a set of doctrines, it is to enter into a way of reading, a set of practices for living. The stories, the soul's immortality, the reminiscence of the forms, the ascent of Eros, the divine craft of the demiurge, are meant to train the imagination. They are parables about what it means to live with a certain kind of hope, that the life of the mind is not a solitary, dispassionate enterprise, but a disciplined and passionate engagement with truth, beauty, and goodness. The aim is not cynicism about the world, but a hopeful insistence that order is accessible to those who cultivate reason as a form of love. If we cultivate such reverence for proportion and justice in the inner life, then when we address the world, cities, schools, theaters, courts, we do so with a more faithful sense of what is at stake. Let us now test these claims against a few counterarguments in more detail, and then consider how the Platonic framework has lived on in the arc of philosophical tradition. First counterargument. Aristotle's critique that virtue is a mean and that knowledge alone does not guarantee moral action. Aristotle's claim is not merely technical, it concerns the texture of ethical life. If virtue is the mean relative to us, then even with knowledge of the good, action can fail unless practical wisdom, phronsis, guides it. The virtuous person in Aristotle does not merely know what is good. They desire it and feel the right motivation to act in the right moment. In Plato, by contrast, knowledge of the forms is the condition for virtue. The will follows knowledge. The countercharge is that this makes moral life brittle. You can be a paragon of theoretical wisdom and still act with cold calculation or indifference if you do not have the right feelings, the right temper, the habituated responsiveness of character. The challenge for a Platonist, then, is to show how knowledge rises from inquiry to habituation, from rational grasp to the stable dispositions that render action reliable. Plato's response would be to insist on the role of philosophical education and the formation of desire, to teach the soul to take pleasure in what is good, to make the good attractive, and to ensure that the rational part governs so as to coordinate the appetites and the spirited energies. Second counterargument, ontological essentialism about forms, the worry about the durability and independence of the forms, and the risk of relegating the sensible world to a derivative status. The forms, as Plato conceives them, are timeless, perfect, and more real than the sensible objects we encounter. Critics worry that such a theory uses an ontological scheme that is hard to verify, that makes the sensible world a shadow or a pale copy of the intelligible. The worry intensifies when we ask how we can know the forms at all, given that we only experience the sensible world. The Neoplatonists, with their hierarchical emanation, attempt to solve this by locating the forms in a more comprehensive metaphysical architecture, but the critique persists. Does the world of forms have any causal relation to the things we experience? Is there a method by which we can access the form of beauty or the form of justice as such, independent of cultural or historical conditioning? The Platonic solution is to connect form with knowledge and to locate the soul's ascent through dialectic as the method for approaching the forms. The risk remains, however, that such ascent might become an abstract pursuit disconnected from everyday human life unless the educational practices of the city enable the soul to enact the good in ordinary circumstances. Third counterargument, modern critiques that question the feasibility of separating art from moral influence. The Platonic project is concerned with the ethical shaping of the soul through curation of the arts. If one believes that art inevitably influences moral sensibilities, often in ambiguous or even harmful ways, the question arises, can we separate aesthetics from ethics at all? Some modern theories argue that art inevitably embodies and transmits values, whether the artist intends it or not. If so, Plato's program to use art as a vehicle for virtue becomes more complicated. It becomes a program for evaluating, censoring, or guiding artistic production, not merely to protect the soul, but to cultivate a particular moral psychology or political order. The tension here is real and enduring. How to permit aesthetic freedom while preserving the soul's integrity? Plato's answer leans toward a pedagogy of the soul's formation, a state-guided art that fosters a shared moral horizon rather than a cynical, relativistic pluralism about values in art. Yet the modern critique remains a necessary check, reminding us that beauty and truth cannot be separated from power, culture, and history. Fourth counterargument, debates about the universality of beauty. If beauty is a universal form, then it can serve as a bridge across cultures and epochs. If beauty is culturally contingent, then its universality is questionable. Plato's claim that beauty guides the soul toward the form of beauty and the good depends on an underlying claim about universality, that some aspects of beauty are not relative to taste but are anchored in the intelligible order of the forms. The challenge here is to articulate what is universal about beauty while recognizing diverse human experiences of beauty across cultures and times. The Platonic response would be to distinguish between appearances of beauty, which may vary, and the form of beauty itself, which remains constant and underwrites the multiplicity of beautiful things. The contemporary challenge is to articulate this distinction in a pluralistic world. Can there be a shared, rationally accessible standard of beauty that does not erase difference? And if beauty is a doorway to truth, how do we design institutions, schools, galleries, clinics, media, that use beauty to cultivate good rather than to manipulate taste and appetite? In light of these reflections, let us return to the historical thread that gives texture and depth to Plato's ideas. The late antique Neoplatonists, for example, reinterpreted Plato so that his metaphysical system made sense within a Christian cosmos. Plotinus's ascent out of the soul toward the one reinscribes the ascent of Eros as an ascent toward unity with the divine source of all form. The soul's longing is reinterpreted as a longing for God, the ultimate form of the good. Augustine, building on this heritage, integrates the Platonic idea of form and knowledge into a Christian framework that locates the good in the will of God and grounds moral and intellectual life in divine love. The Renaissance, with Ficino at its center, makes a different turn. The revival of Plato's aesthetic and mathematical sensibilities, the belief that beauty and proportion are the language of the cosmos, and that human beings, by aligning themselves with these patterns, participate in a higher order of reality. The Florentine Academy, the rediscovery of Pythagorean and Platonic mathematics, the translation of Plato into European humanist culture, all of these episodes show how deeply the Platonic project has shaped the modern imagination in ethics, aesthetics, and the philosophy of mind. From this long view, we can trace a line of influence that continues in modern virtue ethics and aesthetics. Aristotle's ethics and Kantian aesthetics both become interlocutors with Plato's project. Aristotle by insisting that virtue requires habituation and rational discernment, and Kant by insisting that aesthetic judgments, while subjective, aspire to universal validity. The Hegelian tradition, with its claim that the absolute spirit unfolds through history and culture, offers a drama of the soul's self-understanding that resonates with Plato's sense of inner ascent toward a higher order. Nietzsche, critical of Platonism, challenges the elevation of form and universal standards, risking a rejection of the metaphysical architecture that Plato sought to defend. Yet even Nietzsche's critique tends to acknowledge a powerful role for art and beauty in shaping moral life, albeit through a different ontology. Contemporary virtue ethics, drawing on Aristotle and other sources, continues to re-enter Plato's orbit. Virtues as stable character traits, the role of practical wisdom in moral action, and the sense that flourishing requires not only right belief but right desire and right social practice. Plato's resonance in these debates is not a simple inheritance, it is an ongoing conversation about how to integrate the life of thought with the life of action. In closing this section, I want to emphasize three threads that run through Plato's thought and that have remained persistent points of reference for philosophers across the ages. First, the unity of ethics, aesthetics, and metaphysics in a single program for life. Second, the central role of the soul's internal order in determining moral action in social life, and the consequent belief that education, art, and ritual are not optional add-ons but essential infrastructure for a just life. Third, the insistence that beauty, love, and desire can be harnessed not for merely private gratification, but as engines for truth and the good. The ascent from desire to truth is not a flight from the world. It is a discipline that invites us to inhabit the world with greater clarity, courage, and fidelity. Let me offer a few final reflections that might serve as a bridge to further sections of the video. The soul's harmony is not a static status but a dynamic practice. It requires constant attention, critique, and reordering in light of new circumstances, whether in a classroom, a court, a studio, or a home. The Timaeus-born cosmology offers us a story in which the order of the cosmos and the order of the soul are parallel projects, each requiring courage to resist the temptations of fragmentation and disorder. The Republic's art critique is not a simple censorship, but an invitation to reimagine education as the cultivation of character through carefully curated forms of beauty. And the ascent of Eros is not merely a romantic or private matter. It is a way to revalue human longing as a path toward knowledge, a way of training the heart to desire what is truly good. In a final turn to primary voices, let us hear a few words that illuminate these themes in Plato's own voice, and then bring those voices into conversation with later thinkers. The Apology offers Socrates' stark, enduring claim. The unexamined life is not worth living. If the soul's life is a life of examined, rationally organized being, then to pursue virtue is to pursue a form of life that makes that scrutiny fruitful, that generates genuine freedom within the bounds of a rational order. The Phaedo invites us to imagine the soul's immortality and the forms as a horizon for intelligence and moral longing. The Symposium invites us to see Eros as a pedagogy of ascent, one that reorients our loves toward the good and the true. The Phaedrus, with its meditations on rhetoric and writing, extends the same claims into the public life, insisting that speech should be ordered toward truth and reform. We must be prepared to hold these voices in tension with the voices that critique or complicate them. The philosopher who wants to preserve the unity of the good must be ready to answer Aristotle's critique about virtues being a mean and knowledge a necessary but not sufficient condition. The philosopher who wants to defend the power of forms must address the charge of ontological essentialism and the risk of disconnect from empirical life. The artist and educator in a modern democracy must respond to concerns about the moral influence of art and the universality of beauty. And yet the Platonic project remains a compelling resource, a theoretical and practical framework for thinking about how we order our inner lives, how we train our desires, and how we cultivate a culture capable of honoring truth, beauty, and goodness together. As we move toward the next part of the course, we will return to more concrete scenes, the actual practices of education in a Platonic city, the ways in which poets and musicians would be integrated or excluded, the kinds of ritual and communal life that would sustain the soul in its ascent, and how a modern reader might translate these ancient ideas into contemporary political and cultural life. We will also consider how the Phaedo's dream of recollection and the Symposium's ladder of love can illuminate our own experiences of learning, longing, and the attempt to live with integrity in the face of distraction and fear. The aim here is not to seal Plato into a museum case, but to keep him alive as a living conversation partner, one whose layered, sometimes challenging arguments continue to illuminate the most intimate spheres of human life. Our loves, our loyalties, our sense of beauty, and our longing for a reality that endures beyond the moment. And so, as a closing image for this segment, imagine the soul as a lyre. The rational part is the guide who tunes the strings. The spirited part gives the instrument its resilience and vigor. The appetitive part keeps the instrument alive, breathing with desire. If the strings are not properly tuned, a note will be sour, a chord discordant. But if the rational part teaches the others to listen to right reason, to seek proportion, to desire what is good, then the lyre becomes capable of making music not merely for private pleasure, but for shared ascent, music that can awaken a city to a more just and beautiful life. This is the Platonic vision, the soul in harmony, beauty as a doorway to truth, and love as the ladder by which the human being climbs toward a unity that is both moral and metaphysical. If we keep these motifs in mind, we will be well prepared for the next part of the journey, translating these enduring ideas into the language of contemporary life, showing how the old questions still carry a living fire, and how a thoughtful encounter with Plato can deepen our own ethical, aesthetic, and metaphysical commitments.